Hello there, my friends, and welcome to another gentle journey through time. Tonight, we're going to discover something truly remarkable about the human spirit. How ordinary people, living simple lives in small villages centuries ago, found ways to endure and even thrive when the world around them grew uncertain. We'll explore the quiet wisdom of medieval peasants, their deep connection to the rhythms of the earth, and the beautiful ways communities came together when times grew challenging. Before we begin our journey, I'd love to ask a small favor. If this gentle exploration brings you some peace tonight, perhaps you'd consider giving this video a like, or subscribing to join our growing community of fellow time travelers. And please, do leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. It always amazes me how many of you are tuning in from different corners of our planet. From cozy bedrooms in Montana to quiet flats in Manchester, from farmhouses in Australia to apartments overlooking busy streets in Tokyo. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all here together, drifting through history as the world sleeps around us. Now then, let's help you settle in for tonight's journey. Find that perfect spot where your body feels completely supported. Pull that soft blanket a little closer. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and allow your breathing to slow down naturally. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your mind. There's nowhere else you need to be right now except right here, in this moment, ready to step back through the mists of time. Close your eyes and let yourself drift backward through the years, through decades, through centuries, until you find yourself blinking awake on a simple straw mattress, covered by a rough woolen blanket that smells faintly of sheep and smoke. The morning air carries a chill that seeps through the gaps in the stone walls around you, and you can hear the soft lowing of cattle in the distance, the gentle clucking of chickens scratching in the dirt just outside your small window. You are a peasant in 14th century England. Your hands are calloused from working the soil, your back strong from years of bending to tend crops and care for animals. The rhythm of your life follows the sun and the seasons, and you know the feel of earth under your fingernails, the satisfaction of bread baked from grain you helped to grow. But lately, something has felt different in the air. The summer rains came strangely, the wheat didn't grow quite as tall as usual, and the old folk have been sharing knowing glances when they think no one is watching. This is a time when survival depended not on grand gestures or dramatic heroics, but on quiet wisdom, gentle cooperation, and the kind of patient resilience that grows slowly, like roots reaching deep into fertile soil. In the gentle rolling hills of medieval England, where morning mist clung to fields of barley and oats, life moved to rhythms that had remained unchanged for generations. The peasant villages dotting the countryside were small worlds unto themselves, places where everyone knew their neighbor's children by name, where the sound of the church bell marked not just the hours but the heartbeat of the community itself. These were not the grand courts we often hear about in history books, with their silk tapestries and golden chalices. This was the England of mud-daubed cottages and thatched roofs, of hands that knew the weight of tools and the texture of fresh-turned earth. Here, in these quiet corners of the world, live people whose names are mostly forgotten now, but whose wisdom about survival, community, and the gentle art of enduring hardship deserves to be remembered and cherished. The 14th century was a time of subtle changes. The climate was shifting in ways that farmers felt in their bones before scholars could name it. What historians would later call the Little Ice Age was beginning to whisper its presence through shorter growing seasons, unexpected frosts, and summers that seemed to lack the full warmth needed to ripen grain properly. But to the peasants living through these changes, it wasn't yet a grand historical event. It was simply a matter of paying closer attention to the signs, of listening more carefully to the wisdom of their elders, and of drawing together as communities in ways that had sustained human life for countless generations. When we think of famine today, we might imagine dramatic scenes of empty fields and desperate circumstances. But for medieval peasants, the challenge of uncertain harvests was more like a quiet test, a slow dance between human ingenuity and nature's unpredictability. These were people who had developed, over hundreds of years, an intricate understanding of how to stretch resources, how to find nourishment in unexpected places, and how to support one another through the gentle bonds of neighbor helping neighbor. Their kitchens held the secrets of making a little go far. They knew which wild plants could supplement a meager meal, how to preserve food through long winters, and how to share burdens in ways that made everyone stronger. Their children learned by watching and listening, absorbing without realizing it the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced similar challenges and found ways not just to survive, but to maintain the small joys that make life worth living. Tonight, we'll walk beside these quiet heroes of history. We'll feel the morning dew on our feet as we check the grain stores, smell the wood smoke curling from cottage chimneys as families gather for simple meals, and hear the soft conversations that took place around kitchen hearths as people shared both worries and solutions. We'll discover that the greatest strength often lies not in fighting against difficulty, but in the patient art of adapting, of finding abundance in simplicity, and of remembering that even in uncertain times, there is always something beautiful to be found in the gentle rhythms of daily life. As we begin this journey together, let your breathing slow and deepen. There's no need to remember every detail of what we'll explore tonight. Simply let the images and sensations wash over you like a gentle stream, carrying you deeper into rest and peace. The morning mist clung longer to the fields that summer, lingering like a gentle visitor reluctant to leave, wrapping the rolling countryside in whispers of white that seemed to muffle even the rooster's crow. Let yourself settle deeper into your pillow as we step into the worn leather shoes of Thomas the Plowman, a man whose calloused hands knew every stone and furrow of his small plot of land in the English countryside. The year was 1315, and summer had arrived wearing an unfamiliar face. Thomas stirred before dawn, as he had every morning for 37 summers. The straw beneath his ruffle blanket rustled softly as he rose, careful not to wake his wife Emma or their 2 young children who slept soundly in the cottage's single room. The air felt different, heavier somehow, carrying the scent of rain that had fallen steadily for days. He pushed open the wooden door of their modest stone cottage, its hinges creaking their familiar morning song. Usually, by this hour, the mist would be lifting from the barley fields, revealing the golden tips of grain that promised a good harvest. But today, like so many mornings this strange summer, the fog sat stubbornly over his half-acre plot, thick as sheep's wool and twice as persistent. Thomas pulled his rough-spun tunic closer around his shoulders. Even in July, there was a chill in the air that seemed to seep into his bones. He walked slowly toward the well, his bare feet finding their way along the familiar path worn smooth by years of the same morning journey. The wooden bucket descended into the well with its usual hollow echo, but when Thomas drew it up, he paused. The water level seemed lower than it should be after so much rain. Strange, he thought, running his thumb along the rope. The rain had been near constant for weeks, yet somehow the well showed signs of thirst. Emma appeared in the doorway, her brown hair braided simply down her back, her face bearing the patient expression of a woman who had learned to read her husband's moods as clearly as he read the sky. She said nothing, but her eyes asked the question they'd both been thinking for weeks. What is happening to our summer? Thomas had learned to read the land the way monks read their prayer books, with reverence, attention, and the understanding that every detail mattered. His father had taught him, and his father's father before that, stretching back through generations of men who had worked this same soil with the same gentle persistence. The barley should have been ready for cutting by now. Instead, the stalks stood pale and uncertain, their heads only half filled with grain. Thomas ran his fingers along the tops of the plants, feeling their texture, noting how they bent differently in the breeze. There was a softness to them that spoke of too much moisture, not enough sun. He walked the perimeter of his small field, noting how the furrows held standing water in places where the soil should have been merely damp. The drainage channels he'd dug in spring, following the same pattern his father had shown him, seemed inadequate for this summer's persistent rains. Near the edge of his plot, where his land met the common grazing ground, Thomas knelt down and scooped up a handful of earth. It was the gesture of a man who had performed this ritual countless times, but today the soil felt different in his palm. Cooler, waterlogged, with a slick quality that made it slide between his fingers like wet clay. The earthworms were deeper than usual, always a sign of too much surface water. Even the insects seemed different this summer. Fewer bees hummed among the wildflowers that grew along the stone walls dividing the fields. The butterflies that usually danced over the barley in lazy, sun-drunk spirals were scarce. Thomas straightened slowly, his knees protesting the movement. At 37, he was not yet old, but the constant bending and lifting of farm work had settled into his joints like familiar visitors. He brushed the damp soil from his hands and looked up at the sky, searching for answers in the endless gray expanse above. One by one, the other cottages in the village began to show signs of life. Thin wisps of smoke rose from thatched roofs as morning fires were coaxed to life. The gentle sounds of daily routine began their familiar symphony. The soft lowing of cows waiting to be milked, the splash of water buckets being filled, the quiet murmur of morning prayers drifting from open doorways. Thomas walked toward the village center, following the narrow path that connected his cottage to the others. The path was muddy, much muddier than it should be in what was supposed to be the dry season. His feet squelched softly with each step, and he found himself stepping carefully around puddles that had become permanent fixtures of the summer landscape. Margaret the baker was already at work, her stone oven glowing warmly in the pre-dawn darkness. Through her open window, Thomas could see her kneading dough with the steady rhythm that had marked her mornings for 20 years. But even Margaret's routine seemed affected by the strange weather. She had mentioned to Emma at market that her bread was taking longer to rise, the dough sluggish in the humid air. Young Peter the shepherd was leading his small flock toward the common grazing area, but Thomas noticed the boy's usual cheerful whistle was absent. The sheep moved slowly, their wool heavy with moisture, their usual eagerness for fresh grass dampened by the soggy conditions underfoot. The village well stood in the center of the small square, surrounded by its familiar circle of worn stones. Already, 2 other women had gathered there, their voices low and serious as they drew water for their families. Thomas recognized the tone. It was the same careful, measured way people spoke when they sensed something was changing but couldn't yet name what it was. It wasn't any single thing that marked this summer as different. It was the accumulation of small observations, like pebbles gathering in a stream until they changed the water's flow entirely. Thomas had lived through difficult seasons before. Every peasant knew that farming was a conversation with uncertainty, that each year brought its own challenges and surprises. But this felt different in a way that made his stomach tighten with unnamed worry. The grain in the field storage areas, the common barns where the village pooled some of their harvest, seemed to be lasting longer than usual from the previous year. At first, this had seemed like a blessing. Perhaps they had been more careful with their stores, more prudent in their consumption. But Thomas was beginning to understand that it wasn't wisdom that made the grain last longer. It was the fact that this year's crop was going to be smaller than anyone wanted to admit. He had noticed it in the way old Willem, the village elder, had been walking through the fields more frequently, his weathered hands running over the grain stalks with the careful attention of a man taking inventory. Willem never spoke of his concerns directly. It wasn't his way to spread worry like seeds in fertile ground. But his increased presence in the fields told its own story. The children, too, seemed to sense something in the air. Their games had taken on a different quality lately. Instead of the wild, carefree play of summer, they gathered in smaller groups, their voices quieter, their activities more focused around the cottages rather than ranging freely across the fields and into the woods. Emma had mentioned that the women's conversations at the well had grown longer, more thoughtful. They lingered over their daily water gathering, sharing observations about their gardens, their stores, their husbands' moods. It was the kind of subtle information sharing that happened in small communities when people sensed the need to be more aware, more connected, more prepared for whatever was coming. But there was comfort in these small rituals of awareness. The village had weathered difficult times before. There was strength in the daily routines, in the knowledge passed down through generations, in the quiet cooperation that bound the community together like the interwoven branches of a well-tended hedge. Thomas walked back toward his cottage, where Emma would be starting the morning porridge and the children would soon be stirring. Whatever this strange summer brought, they would face it the same way their ancestors had faced uncertainty, with patience, observation, and the quiet determination that came from knowing that survival was not a grand gesture, but a series of small, careful choices made day after day. As the sun finally broke through the persistent clouds in the late afternoon, casting long, golden shadows across the wet fields, Thomas stood once more at the edge of his barley plot. The light, when it came, was beautiful, the kind of warm, honeyed glow that made even the most ordinary cottage garden look like something from a dream. The stalks of grain swayed gently in the evening breeze, their movement creating soft, whispering sounds that seemed to carry conversations between the plants themselves. Thomas listened to this sound, letting it wash over him like a familiar lullaby. His father had taught him to listen to the grain, to hear in its rustling the secrets of growth and weather and time. Tonight, the barley whispered of patience, of waiting, of adapting to conditions that couldn't be changed, only endured with grace. Emma called softly from the cottage doorway, and Thomas turned toward home. The children's laughter drifted through the evening air, mixed with the gentle sounds of the village settling into twilight, the soft closing of doors, the final conversations between neighbors, the contented sounds of animals being settled for the night. Whatever tomorrow would bring. Tonight there was still the warmth of family, the comfort of routine, the quiet strength that came from being part of something larger than oneself. The strange summer continued, but so did the rhythms of life that had sustained these people through countless seasons of uncertainty. And as the mist began to gather once again over the fields, preparing for another night of gentle transformation, Thomas felt the deep satisfaction that came from another day lived with attention, care, and quiet resilience. Old Willem squinted at the horizon with eyes that had seen 60 summers pass like gentle waves across the English countryside. His weathered hands, rough as oak bark from decades of farm work, rested on the wooden fence post as he studied the morning sky with the patience of a man who had learned to listen to whispers others could not hear. The sun had risen later than usual for this time of year, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. Willem noticed these things the way a mother notices the slightest change in her child's breathing. The sky held secrets, and he had spent a lifetime learning its language. "Come here, young Thomas," Willem called softly to his grandson, a boy of perhaps 12 summers who was scattering grain for the chickens. "Tell me what you see when you look up there." Thomas wiped his hands on his rough woolen tunic and approached his grandfather with the easy trust of youth. Following Willem's gaze, he looked up at the morning sky, squinting slightly against the pale light. "I see clouds, grandfather. Some white ones, and some that look a bit gray." Willem nodded slowly, his beard catching the morning breeze. "Ah, you see clouds. But what do the clouds tell you, lad? Look closer. See how they move, how they gather, how they speak to one another across the heavens." This was the way of learning in the countryside. Not from books, for few could read, but from the patient observation of those who had watched the sky long enough to understand its moods. Willem's father had taught him, just as his father's father had passed down the knowledge before that, in an unbroken chain of wisdom stretching back through countless generations. The old man pointed with a gnarled finger toward the eastern horizon. "See there, how those clouds bunch together like sheep seeking shelter. And notice the way they move, not rushing like they do before a quick summer storm, but rolling slow and steady, like millstones grinding grain." Thomas followed his grandfather's gesture, beginning to see patterns where before he had seen only sky. The clouds did indeed seem to huddle together, their edges soft and gray, moving with a purposeful deliberation across the heavens. "When clouds gather like that," Willem continued, his voice carrying the gentle authority of experience, "and when they come from the east as they do now, it tells us we may have rain for more days than we'd prefer. Not the kind of rain that comes hard and fast, and then moves on, blessing the crops with a good drink. This is the kind that settles in like an unwelcome guest who won't take the hint to leave." The boy nodded, storing this knowledge away in the way children do when they sense they are being taught something important. Around them, the village was beginning to stir with the familiar sounds of morning, the lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the creak of doors opening, the soft murmur of voices as neighbors called gentle greetings to one another. Willem had been reading the sky since he was younger than Thomas, learning first from his own grandfather, old Henrik, who had lived through famines and plenty, through seasons that brought abundance and years that tested the very spirit of the community. Henrik had been a man of few words, but when he spoke of the weather, everyone listened. "The sky is like a great book," Henrik used to say, "written in a language older than words. Learn to read it, and you'll never be caught unprepared by what the heavens decide to send." Now Willem carried that knowledge, and it had served him well through decades of farming, helping him know when to plant and when to wait, when to harvest early and when to let the crops ripen just a little longer. It was knowledge that could mean the difference between a family eating well through the winter and going to bed with empty bellies. "Look at the way the wind moves through the barley," Willem said, directing Thomas's attention to the field that stretched out before them. The grain swayed in waves, like a golden sea responding to invisible currents. "See how it bends but doesn't break? The stalks are telling us about the strength and direction of the wind. When the grain dances like that, moving all in one direction, it means the wind has purpose. It's not just a gentle breeze passing through. It's part of a larger pattern." Thomas watched the barley field, beginning to see it not just as crops growing in neat rows, but as a living messenger, constantly receiving and interpreting signals from the sky above. The way the grain moved told stories about pressure and moisture, about the great invisible forces that shaped the weather day by day. "My grandfather taught me to watch the animals too," Willem continued, settling more comfortably against the fence post. "They know things we've forgotten, or perhaps never knew." Have you noticed how the sparrows have been acting these past few days? The boy shook his head, realizing there was so much around him that he had been seeing but not truly observing. They've been gathering in larger flocks than usual for this time of year, Willem explained. Flying closer to the ground, staying near the hedgerows instead of soaring high. When birds change their habits like that, it's because they sense something coming. Their tiny hearts beat so fast, they feel the changes in the air before we do. As if summoned by their conversation, a small flock of sparrows swept past them, staying low just as Willem had described, their wings working harder than usual against the thickening air. Thomas watched them with new eyes, seeing for the first time how their flight patterns seemed urgent, purposeful, different from the lazy loops and dives he had observed on clearer days. And the cats, Willem added with a slight smile. Have you seen how our barn cat has been sleeping? Curled up tighter than usual, seeking out the warmest corners, staying closer to the cottage. Animals feel the pressure changes in their bones, just as old folks like me feel them in our joints. Indeed, Thomas realized their old tabby cat had been behaving exactly as his grandfather described, spending more time than usual curled up by the hearth, seeming to anticipate cold even when the days still held summer's warmth. Willem's knowledge extended beyond just reading the immediate signs. He understood the larger patterns, the way seasons flowed into one another, the subtle signals that indicated whether the coming winter might be harsh or mild, whether spring would arrive early or late. This understanding came from decades of careful observation, of noting which signs preceded which outcomes, of building a mental library of sky language that he could consult whenever uncertainty threatened. There's a smell to the air when long rains are coming, he told Thomas, inhaling deeply through his weathered nose. It's not the fresh, clean smell of a summer shower. It's heavier, earthier, like the smell of a cellar that's been closed up too long. Can you catch it? Thomas breathed in, trying to detect what his grandfather's experienced senses could perceive. There was indeed something different about the air, a thickness, a weight that seemed to press gently against his skin and lungs. The old-timers used to say you could taste the rain on your tongue days before it fell, Willem continued. There's some truth to that. When the air holds more moisture than usual, everything changes. The way sounds carry, the way smoke rises from chimneys, even the way bread rises in the oven. This connection between weather and daily life was something Thomas was just beginning to understand. Weather wasn't something that simply happened outside while people went about their business indoors. It was intimately connected to every aspect of village life, from the success of crops to the comfort of families, from the behavior of animals to the rhythm of work and rest. Willem pointed toward the church tower in the distance, its stone spire rising above the thatched roofs of the village. See how clear the tower looks today? You can make out every stone, every detail. That's another sign. When distant objects appear unusually sharp and clear, it often means rain is gathering strength somewhere beyond the horizon. The old man's weather wisdom extended to understanding the moods of different seasons, the personality of each month, the way weather patterns repeated themselves in cycles that could span years or even decades. He had lived through enough cycles to recognize the signs of what the old people called strange years, times when the usual patterns shifted, when summer came too early or stayed too late, when winter forgot to release its grip or arrived before the harvest was complete. There are rhythms to the sky that take years to understand, Willem said thoughtfully. Some patterns repeat every few years, others take decades to complete their cycle. The wise farmer learns to read not just the immediate signs, but the longer stories the sky tells. Thomas listened intently, beginning to understand that weather prediction was not just about knowing if tomorrow would bring sun or rain, but about understanding the deeper currents of climate and season, the way years of abundance might be followed by years of scarcity, the way the sky prepared communities for challenges that might still be months away. As the morning progressed and the strange clouds continued their slow march across the sky, Willem shared more of his accumulated wisdom. He spoke of ice rings around the moon that predicted frost, of the way certain winds brought specific types of weather, of how the behavior of insects and the growth patterns of plants all contributed to the great conversation between earth and sky that never ceased. The most important thing to remember, Willem concluded as the sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the field, is that the sky is always honest. It never lies, never tries to deceive. If we learn to listen properly, to watch with patience and attention, it will always tell us what we need to know. Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of this inheritance of knowledge. understanding that what his grandfather was sharing was more valuable than gold or silver. In a world where survival depended on working with the rhythms of nature rather than against them, the ability to read the sky's messages could mean the difference between prosperity and hardship, between a village that thrived and one that merely endured. As they walked back toward the cottage, the strange clouds continued their patient journey across the heavens, carrying messages that Willem could read like ancient scripture. The sky was preparing to tell a story, and thanks to his grandfather's gentle teaching, Thomas was beginning to learn the language in which that story would be written. The old ways of knowing were being passed down once again, as they had been for countless generations, in the quiet moments between grandfather and grandson, in the patient observation of clouds and wind, in the deep understanding that humans were not separate from the natural world, but part of its endless, intricate conversation. And somewhere in the gathering clouds, the sky continued writing its patient message about the strange famine that was still to come. In the dim light of the village storehouse, sacks of grain stood like silent sentinels, their burlap surfaces dusty from the summer's harvest. The thick stone walls kept the interior cool and dry, creating a hushed sanctuary where the community's most precious resources waited patiently for the months ahead. Here, in this sacred space of survival, the village's quiet leaders gathered to assess what they had, and more importantly, what they might need. Edmund the Reeve moved between the rows of grain sacks with the careful steps of a man who understood the weight of responsibility. His weathered hands, stained permanently brown from decades of handling grain, traced the sides of each sack as he counted, his lips moving silently as he calculated numbers that would determine whether his neighbors would eat well or go hungry in the coming months. The morning light filtered through the single small window, casting long rectangles of gold across the earthen floor. Dust motes danced in the beam like tiny spirits, and the air held the comforting smell of wheat and barley, oats and rye, the fundamental fragrances of survival that had sustained this community for generations beyond memory. Father Aldrich, Edmund called softly to the village priest, who stood near the door with Brother Marcus, the abbey's young scribe. "Would you help me with the counting? These old eyes sometimes see numbers that aren't there, especially when the counting matters as much as it does now." Father Aldrich approached with the measured pace of a man accustomed to bearing the weight of his community's concerns. His brown robes rustled gently against the packed earth floor as he joined Edmund beside the largest pile of grain sacks. The priest's presence here was not unusual. In times of uncertainty, the church often served as mediator and record keeper, helping to ensure that resources would be distributed fairly when need arose. "How does it look this year?" Father Aldrich asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. The strange weather patterns that old Willem had been reading in the clouds were becoming apparent in more concrete ways. In yields that were lower than expected, in grain that hadn't filled out as fully as it should have. Edmund ran his hand along the top of a sack, feeling the grain shift beneath the rough fabric. "Not as well as we hoped, Father. Not as poorly as we feared, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We'll need to be more mindful than usual about how we use what we have." This was the delicate language of rural leadership, never causing panic, but always preparing for possibilities. Edmund had learned this diplomatic speech from his father, who had been Reeve before him, and who had guided the village through lean years in the past. The art lay in acknowledging reality without surrendering hope, in planning for hardship without creating despair. Brother Marcus stepped forward, his young face earnest in the golden light. He carried a piece of parchment and a quill, ready to record the inventory that would become the village's blueprint for survival. "Shall I begin the tally, Master Edmund?" "Aye, lad. Start with the wheat." Edmund moved to the first row of sacks, each one representing weeks of backbreaking labor under the summer sun, hours of threshing and winnowing, the collective effort of families working together to secure their future. 23 sacks of good wheat, each one holding what we'd normally expect for a full harvest. But even as he spoke the numbers, Edmund's experienced I could see that these sacks didn't sit quite as full and round as they should. The grain had grown, yes, but the strange weather had affected the kernel size, the weight per bushel. Each sack might look the same from the outside, but carried perhaps a tenth less nourishment than in a normal year. Father Aldrich moved to the barley, running his hands over the coarse sacks with the same careful attention Edmund had shown. Barley was the backbone of the peasant diet, made into bread when wheat was scarce, brewed into the weak ale that served as a safe alternative to often contaminated water, fed to animals when pasture grew thin. 18 sacks of barley, the priest announced, his voice carrying a note of concern. And I can feel they're not as heavy as we might wish. The counting continued in this quiet, methodical way. Each grain type was assessed not just for quantity but for quality, for the subtle signs that spoke of a harvest affected by too much rain at the wrong times, by sun that had hidden behind clouds during crucial growing weeks, by all the small weather irregularities that old Willem had been reading in the sky. Edmund opened one of the oat sacks, letting the grain run through his fingers like pale gold. Oats were crucial for the horses and oxen that powered the village's agricultural work, but they could also be ground into meal for human consumption when other grains ran short. The texture felt different this year, not quite as plump, not quite as substantial. The oats will do, he said carefully, but we'll want to mix them with other grains more than usual. They haven't the substance to carry us alone if need arises. This was the wisdom of experience speaking, understanding not just what they had, but how to make the most of it. Edmund knew which grains could be stretched with others, which could be ground fine to make them go further, which would store longest without spoiling. This knowledge had been passed down through generations of village leaders, refined through cycles of abundance and scarcity. Brother Marcus continued his careful recording, his quill scratching softly against the parchment. As he noted not just numbers but observations. The abbey would keep its own stores, but it also served as a backup for the village in times of genuine need. The young monk understood that these quiet calculations might someday determine whether families lived or died, whether the community survived intact or scattered to seek survival elsewhere. As they worked through the inventory, other quiet leaders drifted into the storehouse. Sarah, the baker's wife, whose knowledge of flour and grain was legendary throughout the village. Thomas, the miller, whose understanding of how grain could be processed and preserved was unmatched. Margaret, the alewife, who knew how barley could be transformed into sustenance in liquid form. Each brought their own expertise to the quiet assessment. Sarah examined handfuls of wheat, feeling for the weight and texture that would tell her how the grain would behave when ground into flour. Thomas checked for signs of moisture or pest damage that could ruin stored grain over the winter months. Margaret assessed the barley's suitability for brewing, understanding that ale was often safer to drink than water, especially during long winter months. The storehouse filled with gentle murmurs of discussion, the soft sounds of grain being shifted and examined, the rustling of sacks being repositioned for better storage. This was community leadership at its most fundamental level. Not grand pronouncements or dramatic gestures, but careful, informed planning based on deep understanding of what their people would need to survive. As the afternoon light began to slant differently through the small window, Edmund straightened his back and looked around at the assembled stores. The numbers told a story that was neither disaster nor plenty, but something in between, a harvest that would require wisdom, cooperation, and perhaps a touch of luck to carry them safely through to spring. "We have enough," he said finally, his words carrying the weight of decision. "But only if we're careful. Only if we work together as we always have." The quiet leaders nodded, understanding the unspoken compact they were making. To watch over their community's resources with the same care they would guard their own families, to make decisions based on the common good rather than individual advantage. In the golden dust of the village storehouse, surrounded by the fundamental building blocks of survival, they had taken the first careful steps toward weathering whatever strange challenges the sky might choose to send. The gentle rhythm of kneading dough had remained unchanged for generations, a meditation of survival that connected every village woman to her mothers and grandmothers stretching back through countless centuries. In the pre-dawn darkness of her small cottage kitchen, Agnes worked the dough with practiced hands, feeling the grain respond to her touch as it had done every morning for the past 30 years. The dough felt different this morning. Not wrong, exactly, but changed in subtle ways that spoke to Agnes of the strange harvest they had gathered. The flour ground from this year's wheat had a slightly different texture, requiring just a touch more water to bind properly, taking longer to develop the smooth elasticity that meant good bread would emerge from her oven. Agnes had learned the art of bread making from her mother, who had learned from her mother before that, in an unbroken chain of knowledge that was more valuable than gold. Each woman had passed down not just recipes, but the deeper understanding of how grain could be coaxed and transformed, how a family could be fed even when the harvest was less generous than hoped. The secret, her mother had always said, is in knowing your grain. Each year's harvest has its own personality, its own needs. Listen to what the dough tells you, and it will never lead you astray. This morning, As Agnes worked the pale mass between her palms, she listened carefully to what this year's grain was trying to tell her. The wheat had grown during those strange, cloudy months that old Willem had been watching so carefully. Too much rain at the wrong times, not enough sun during the crucial weeks when the kernels should have been filling with starches and proteins. The result was flour that was perfectly adequate, but required different handling. Agnes adjusted her technique almost unconsciously, adding a pinch more salt to strengthen the dough, working it longer to develop the gluten that would give the bread its structure. These were the kinds of adaptations that kept families fed when conditions weren't perfect. As she kneaded, other sounds of morning began to filter through the thin walls of the cottage. The soft lowing of cows being led to pasture, the creak of doors opening, the gentle murmur of neighbors greeting each other as the village stirred to life. Soon, other women would be at their own tables, working their own portions of dough, each making the small adjustments that experience taught them. Agnes shaped her dough into loaves, covering them with clean linen cloths to rise in the warmth near the hearth. While she waited, she turned her attention to the day's other bread, the coarser loaves made from barley flour that would feed the family when the wheat bread was gone. Barley bread was the foundation of peasant survival. It was heartier than wheat, more filling, and the grain grew more reliably in poor conditions. The flour was darker, the texture denser, but when made skillfully it could be nearly as satisfying as the finest wheat loaves. Agnes had perfected her barley bread recipe through years of experimentation, learning how to combine it with small amounts of other grains to create loaves that were both nourishing and pleasant to eat. This morning, she decided to try something her grandmother had taught her long ago, mixing a small portion of ground oats into the barley flour. The oats would add a subtle sweetness and help the bread stay moist longer. In times when grain needed to be stretched as far as possible, every small improvement in nutrition and flavor mattered. As she worked the barley dough, Agnes thought about the conversations she had overheard between her husband and the other men. Quiet discussions about the harvest, about the grain stores, about the need to be mindful in the coming months. She understood the coded language of rural concern, the way serious problems were discussed in careful, measured terms that didn't create panic but prepared people for what might come. The barley dough felt substantial under her hands, earthy and dense. This was honest bread, the kind that had sustained working families through countless seasons of uncertainty. It might not have the light texture of fine wheat bread, but it carried the nutrition that would keep bodies strong through long days of physical labor. Agnes divided the barley dough into smaller portions, shaping them into the round, flat loaves that cooked most evenly in her simple oven. She scored the tops with a sharp knife, creating the traditional cross pattern that helped the bread bake through while marking it with the blessing that every loaf deserved. As the morning progressed, the cottage filled with the incomparable aroma of baking bread. First the wheat loaves, pale and golden, their crust singing softly as they cooled. Then the barley bread, darker and more substantial, carrying the honest scent of grain that had grown from the earth through rain and sun to become sustenance. Agnes lifted the loaves from her oven with the wooden paddle her father had carved for her mother decades ago. Each loaf was a small victory, a transformation of grain into food that would nourish her family for another day. She examined them with the critical eye of experience, noting how the strange harvest had affected the way they baked, storing away knowledge that might be useful in the days to come. When her neighbor Mary stopped by, as she did most mornings, Agnes was ready with the kind of practical wisdom that kept communities fed. "The wheat needs a gentler hand this year," she shared, breaking off a piece of the morning's bread for Mary to taste. "And the barley responds well to a touch of oatmeal mixed in. Makes it lighter, more like what the children are used to." Mary nodded, understanding the significance of these observations. Information like this spread quietly through the village, woman to woman, kitchen to kitchen, building a collective knowledge base that helped everyone adapt to the challenges of the changing harvest. As the sun climbed higher and the day's work began in earnest, Agnes wrapped most of her bread in clean cloths, storing it in the wooden chest that kept it fresh and safe from mice. But she set aside the less-than-perfect loaves, the ones with crusts that had baked a bit too dark or shapes that hadn't formed quite right. These would go into the soup pot, where they would become the foundation for the evening's meal. Bread and broth, vegetables from the garden, perhaps a bit of bacon from the pig they had slaughtered in the autumn. Nothing would be wasted. Every crumb would serve its purpose in keeping her family strong. In the quiet rhythm of daily bread making, Agnes embodied the gentle resilience that would carry her community through whatever challenges lay ahead. With skilled hands and accumulated wisdom, she transformed grain into sustenance, uncertainty into security, one loaf at a time. Beyond the cultivated fields lay the ancient forest, keeper of secrets and provider of quiet gifts. As the strange summer had given way to an uncertain autumn, the villagers found themselves turning their eyes toward the woodland edges with a reverence that had been passed down through countless generations. You rise before dawn, as peasants have always done, but today your steps carry you not toward the barley fields, but along the worn path that leads into the forest's gentle embrace. The morning air carries the rich scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, a perfume that speaks of abundance hidden beneath the surface of things. The forest in medieval times was not the wild, untamed wilderness we might imagine today. It was a carefully managed resource, a living larder that belonged to the community as much as any cultivated field. Every peasant child learned to read its signs, to understand its seasons, and to take only what was needed while leaving enough for tomorrow. Your grandmother walks beside you, her weathered hands pointing out treasures that untrained eyes might miss entirely. "There," she whispers, her voice soft as falling leaves. "The hazelnuts are ready." Her fingers, gnarled with age but still nimble, show you how to test the nuts with a gentle squeeze, listening for the subtle sound that tells you they're perfectly ripe. The medieval forest offered a pharmacy and pantry combined, its gifts changing with the gentle rhythm of the seasons. In early spring, there were the tender young leaves of beech trees, mild and slightly sweet, perfect for adding to the evening pottage when winter stores ran low. The peasants called these bread and cheese for their satisfying nature, and children would often munch on them during long days in the forest. As spring deepened into summer, wild garlic carpeted the forest floor in patches of green starred with white flowers. The pungent leaves added flavor to the simplest meals, turning thin broths into something that felt like abundance. Your grandmother shows you how to harvest only the outer leaves, leaving the heart of each plant to continue growing. A lesson in sustainability that was simply common sense to medieval folk. But it's autumn now, and the forest wears its richest garments. Blackberries hang heavy on their thorny canes, each cluster a small miracle of sweetness. You move slowly through the brambles, your rough woolen clothes protecting you from the thorns, filling your woven basket with the dark fruit. Some will be eaten fresh, bringing moments of pure joy to children's faces. Others will be dried for winter, or made into conserves with precious honey when it can be spared. The mushroom season brings both excitement and careful knowledge. Your grandmother's eyes are sharp as she examines each fungus, teaching you the subtle differences between the safe and the dangerous. "This one," she says, pointing to a cluster of oyster mushrooms growing on a fallen oak. "See how they grow in overlapping shelves? And smell, earthy but clean, never sour." The peasants had names for all the safe mushrooms, passed down through generations. Field mushrooms that appeared after rain, the honey-colored ones that grew on dying trees, the small brown caps that could be dried and stored for months. Each type had its season, its preferred hiding spots, its own particular flavor to add to the evening meal. Acorns were perhaps the forest's most generous gift, falling in abundance from the great oak trees that had stood since before memory. These nuts required patience and knowledge to prepare. They were bitter and inedible raw, but medieval peasants had learned the secrets of processing them. The acorns would be shelled, ground, and leached in running water to remove the bitter tannins, then dried and ground into a flour that could be mixed with precious grain to make bread stretch further. The work was tedious but communal. Women would sit together by the stream, their hands busy with the acorns while their voices wove the social fabric of the village tighter. Children played nearby, learning through observation, sometimes helping to crack the nuts with small stones, their young hands gradually developing the skills they would need as adults. Elder trees offered their dark berries in late summer, tart and rich with goodness. The peasants knew these berries could ward off winter sickness, though they wouldn't have used words like vitamin C. They simply knew that families who gathered elderberries seemed to suffer less from the coughs and fevers that came with the cold months. Wild apples, small and often sour, could be found in forest clearings where old homesteads had once stood. These were treasured finds. They could be cooked down into a sauce, dried for winter eating, or even fermented into a weak cider that provided both nourishment and a brief respite from the hardships of daily life. The forest floor itself offered sustenance to those who knew where to look. Wild onions pushed up through the leaf mold, their green shoots adding pungency to soups. Wood sorrel, with its distinctive three-leafed shape and lemony tang, could be eaten fresh or dried for later use. Even the inner bark of certain trees, birch, pine, aspen, could be prepared as emergency food when other sources failed. But perhaps most precious were the herbs that grew in the forest's quiet places. Nettle, fierce with its sting but mild when cooked, provided green nutrition when the body craved it most. Wild mint grew by streams, offering both flavor and digestive comfort. Chamomile dotted sunny clearings with its daisy-like flowers, promising peaceful sleep when brewed into tea. The medieval peasants moved through their forest with a knowledge that was both practical and spiritual. They understood that the forest was not just a resource to be exploited, but a living community of which they were a part. The unwritten laws of forest foraging were strict. Never take more than you need, never harvest the first or last of anything, always leave enough for the forest's other inhabitants. The rights to forest foraging were carefully regulated but generally recognized. Even the poorest peasant had the right to gather fallen wood, dead branches for fuel, and certain forest foods for their family's use. These were called common rights, and they formed an essential part of the social contract that allowed medieval communities to survive. As the afternoon light filters through the changing leaves, painting everything in gold and amber, you and your grandmother make your way home. Your baskets are full, but not overflowing. You've taken what you need and left the rest. The forest will continue to provide day after day, season after season, as long as it's treated with respect and understanding. Back in the village, your gathered treasures will be processed with the same careful attention. Berries will be dried on wooden frames near the fire. Nuts will be shelled and stored in clay pots. Mushrooms will be threaded on strings and hung from the cottage rafters. Each small preparation is an act of faith in the future, a quiet confidence that careful work today will mean survival tomorrow. The forest's gifts were never taken for granted by medieval peasants. They understood, in ways we've sometimes forgotten, that abundance comes not from taking everything at once, but from understanding the rhythms of nature and working within them. The forest provided not just food, but medicine, materials for crafts and tools, and a deep sense of connection to the land that sustained life. As evening settles over the village, and the forest becomes a dark line against the horizon, you might reflect on the quiet wisdom of those medieval foragers. They faced uncertainties we can barely imagine: strange weather, failing crops, the constant specter of hunger. Yet they found ways to thrive by understanding their place in the larger web of life. The forest's bounty was always there, waiting for those who knew how to see it, how to harvest it respectfully, and how to prepare it with care. In the gentle relationship between the medieval peasants and their forest, we can find a model of sustainability that speaks across the centuries, reminding us that true security comes not from stockpiling resources, but from understanding how to live in harmony with the natural world that sustains us all. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself walking those forest paths, your footsteps soft on the carpet of leaves, your eyes learning to see the abundance that surrounds us always, waiting quietly to provide for those who approach with respect, knowledge, and gratitude. When Mary's cow fell ill, the whole lane seemed to lean in closer, as if the very houses themselves understood that one family's misfortune was everyone's concern. You wake to the sound of quiet voices outside your cottage window, not the cheerful chatter of market day, but the low, earnest murmur of neighbors gathering to solve a problem together. In the medieval village, survival was never a solitary endeavor. The thin line between comfort and catastrophe meant that communities had developed intricate networks of mutual aid, unwritten agreements that bound neighbors together more surely than any lord's decree. These weren't grand gestures or formal institutions, but quiet acts of practical kindness that formed the invisible foundation upon which village life rested. You dress quickly in the pre-dawn darkness and step outside to join the small group assembled near Mary's cottage. Her cow, Bess, had been the pride of the lane, a gentle brown creature whose milk had supplemented not just Mary's family meals, but had been shared with the widow next door and the young couple struggling through their first difficult winter. Now Bess lay on her side in the small byre, her breathing labored, her eyes dull with sickness. Old Henrik, who had tended animals for longer than anyone could remember, knelt beside the cow with practiced hands, feeling along her sides, listening to her breathing. "Bloat," he announced quietly. "She's gotten into something that's given her the sickness. We'll need to keep her walking, get some herbs into her." Without a word being spoken, the network of village cooperation began to activate. Agnes hurried back to her cottage to fetch the pennyroyal she'd dried from her garden, known to settle upset stomachs in both animals and humans. Young Tom ran to wake the miller, who kept a store of bran that might help ease the cow's digestion. The blacksmith's wife appeared with a length of rope, understanding instinctively that they'd need to help Bess to her feet. This was how medieval communities functioned, not through formal organizations or written contracts, but through an intricate understanding of mutual dependence. Everyone knew that Mary's family was already stretched thin since her husband had injured his back during the harvest. The loss of their cow would mean no milk for the children, no cheese to see them through the winter, no small surplus to trade for other necessities. But more than that, everyone understood that Mary's crisis could easily become their own. A sick animal, a failed crop, an injury at the wrong time. Any of these misfortunes could befall any family. The help they gave Mary today was an investment in their own future security, a contribution to the invisible bank of goodwill that made village life possible. As the morning light grows stronger, you find yourself naturally falling into the rhythm of communal problem-solving that medieval peasants had perfected over generations. There were no lengthy discussions or debates. Everyone simply understood their role. The older women took charge of preparing herbal remedies, their knowledge of healing accumulated over decades of necessity. The men focused on the physical task of getting Bess moving, their strong hands gentle as they coaxed the sick animal to her feet. The children weren't forgotten in this community effort. They were given the important task of gathering fresh water from the stream, their small legs quick to run errands between cottages. In this way, they learned not just the practical skills of animal care, but the deeper lesson of how a community responds to crisis. Not with panic or blame, but with quiet, coordinated action. Medieval village life had evolved countless subtle mechanisms for sharing both burden and blessing. When harvest time came, families worked each other's fields in turn, understanding that many hands made the back-breaking work bearable. When someone fell ill, neighbors quietly took on their daily tasks, feeding animals, tending fires, watching children, without fanfare or expectation of immediate repayment. The sharing went beyond crisis response. In ordinary times, the village operated as an extended family, with resources flowing naturally to where they were most needed. If one family's hen was particularly productive, eggs might find their way to the cottage where a new baby was draining the mother's strength. If someone's apple tree had an exceptional year, the surplus would be distributed to neighbors whose own trees had been less generous. This wasn't charity in the way we might understand it today, a formal giving from those who have to those who have not. Instead, it was a recognition that abundance and scarcity moved through the community like seasons, touching different families at different times. The family struggling today might be the one with surplus to share tomorrow. You watch Mary's face as her neighbors work to save her cow, and you see in her expression not just gratitude, but the quiet understanding that she would do the same for any of them. This was the unspoken contract that held medieval communities together. Not legal obligation, but something deeper and more reliable. The knowledge that we are all in this together. The village had developed sophisticated ways of organizing mutual aid without formal institutions. There were harvest bees, where families took turns working each other's fields. There were barn raisings, where the entire community would gather to help a family build or repair essential structures. There were spinning circles, where women would gather to work on their individual tasks while sharing labor, knowledge, and companionship. Even the children participated in these networks of mutual support. Young ones were often shared between families, not adopted formally, but absorbed naturally into households where they were needed or where they could receive better care. A family with many daughters might send one to help in a household with many sons, while a family struggling with too many mouths to feed might find that their children were always welcome at tables where there was slightly more to share. The village also had ways of supporting those who couldn't fully support themselves. The elderly weren't abandoned when they could no longer work. Instead, they found themselves seamlessly integrated into younger families' daily routines, their wisdom and experience valued even when their physical strength was gone. They helped with tasks that could be done sitting down, mending, sorting seeds, watching children, telling stories that preserved the community's collective memory. As the day progresses, Bess begins to show signs of improvement. The combination of herbal treatments, gentle exercise, and careful attention is working. But the real medicine, you realize, has been the community's response. The way everyone simply assumed they would help, the way tasks were distributed without argument or resentment, the way Mary's burden became everyone's responsibility. This approach to mutual aid wasn't always perfect, of course. Villages could be places of gossip and judgment as well as support. Those who were seen as not contributing their fair share might find themselves gradually excluded from the networks of reciprocity. But by and large, the system worked because it was based on practical necessity rather than abstract ideals. The medieval peasants understood something that sometimes gets lost in more complex societies: that individual survival and community survival are inextricably linked. They couldn't afford the luxury of pure self-interest, because no single family was strong enough to weather all possible crises alone. Instead, they created communities that were stronger than the sum of their parts, networks of mutual support that could bend without breaking under the weight of misfortune. As evening approaches and Bess stands steady on her own feet once again, chewing contentedly on the hay that neighbors have contributed from their own stores, the crisis passes as quietly as it began. There are no speeches or formal thanks, just the understood recognition that the community has functioned as it should, that the invisible bonds holding everyone together have proven strong once again. You walk home in the gathering dusk, past cottages where lamp light glows warm in windows, where families are settling in for the night, knowing that they are not alone in the world. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own opportunities to give and receive help. But tonight, there is the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when crisis struck, the community responded with the same reliability as sunrise or rainfall. The lesson of medieval village life wasn't that people were naturally more generous or selfless than people today. Rather, it was that they had created systems, informal but effective, that made mutual aid natural and necessary. They understood that a community is only as strong as its most vulnerable members, and that everyone's security depends on everyone else's well-being. In the gentle rhythm of village life, giving and receiving help weren't extraordinary acts of virtue, but simply the way things worked. Like the forest providing its seasonal gifts, like the fields yielding their harvest, like the sun rising each morning, neighbors helping neighbors was part of the natural order of things, reliable, expected, and as essential as breath itself. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself part of such a community, where your well-being matters to others and their well-being matters to you, where help flows naturally toward wherever it's needed, and where no one faces life's challenges entirely alone. In this imagined village, surrounded by the quiet strength of mutual care, even the deepest difficulties become bearable, shared among many hands and many hearts. The great wooden wheel turned slower now, its creaking a thoughtful song that echoed across the village as the stream carried less water than in summers past. You walk the familiar path to the mill in the early morning, your sack of grain heavy on your shoulder, but lighter than it should be for this time of year. The strange weather has left everyone's stores a little thinner, their planning a little more careful. Master Edmund stands in the doorway of his mill, flour dusting his leather apron like snow, his weathered hands resting on the worn wooden frame. His eyes, sharp despite his 60 years, take in your modest sack with the same careful attention he gives to every grain that passes through his stones. The miller, you see, has become something more than a craftsman in these uncertain times. He has become the keeper of the village's most precious resource, the guardian of survival itself. The mill sits where it has for 3 generations, its massive wheel drawing power from the stream that never quite stops flowing, even in the driest seasons. The building itself seems to breathe with the rhythm of the grinding stones, a steady heartbeat that has marked time for the village as surely as the church bells. Inside, the air is thick with the dusty sweetness of ground grain, a perfume that speaks of abundance even when abundance is harder to come by. Master Edmund's role in the village has always been complex, straddling the line between service and authority. He owns the mill, but he serves at the pleasure of the Lord and the necessity of the community. Every peasant must bring their grain here to be ground. It's both law and practical necessity, since few families could afford their own mill stones. But in times like these, when grain is precious and every kernel counts, the miller's wisdom becomes something the entire village depends upon. "Morning, young one," he says, his voice carrying the same steady quality as his mill wheel. "Let's see what you've brought us today." His hands, stained permanently with flour, lift your sack with practiced ease, feeling the weight, assessing the quality of grain through touch alone. This is knowledge accumulated over decades, passed down from his father and grandfather before him. The ability to judge grain like a merchant judges gold. You watch as he unties the sack and lets a small amount of grain pour into his weathered palm. He examines it closely, rolling the kernels between his fingers, bringing a few to his mouth to test them with his teeth. "Good barley," he pronounces finally. A little smaller than last year's crop, but sound. No weevil, no rot. It'll grind fine. The process of milling, you realize as you watch Master Edmund work, is far more complex than simply crushing grain between stones. It's an art that requires understanding the grain itself, the moisture content, the hardness, the way different varieties behave under the massive weight of the millstones. Too fast, and the grain burns from friction. Too slow, and the flour comes out coarse and uneven. The miller must read the grain like a book, adjusting his stones, his speed, his technique to coax the best result from whatever nature has provided. But beyond the technical skill lies something deeper. The miller's role as the village's grain manager during times of scarcity. Master Edmund has been quietly watching the stores coming through his mill, keeping a mental inventory of who has what, who might need help, who might have a little extra to share. He's noticed that Widow Catherine's grain stores are running lower than they should, that young Peter's family is stretching their barley further than is wise, that old Henrik has been bringing in grain more frequently, but in smaller amounts. These are careful times, Master Edmund says as he adjusts the wooden mechanisms that control the flow of grain into the stones. The harvest wasn't what we hoped, but it wasn't what we feared either. We have enough, if we're wise about it. His words carry the weight of authority, but also the comfort of experience. This isn't the first difficult season he's guided the village through, and his calm presence suggests it won't be the last. The mill operates on a system of tolls. The miller keeps a portion of every grain he grinds as payment for his services. In prosperous times, this system works smoothly, with both miller and customer benefiting from the exchange. But in lean times, the toll system becomes a tool for community support. Master Edmund, you notice, has been adjusting his tolls based on need rather than strict calculation. Families with plenty pay their full measure, while those struggling find their tolls mysteriously lighter. As the morning progresses, other villagers arrive with their grain, and you begin to see the mill as something more than a place of business. It's a hub of information and quiet coordination. Here, Master Edmund learns who has stored their grain well and who might need advice on preservation. He hears about families dealing with spoiled stores, about children showing signs of hunger, about elderly folks trying to make their supplies last through the winter. The miller's knowledge extends far beyond the mechanics of grinding grain. He understands storage, how to keep grain dry and safe from pests, how to rotate stores so older grain gets used first, how to blend different grains to stretch supplies without sacrificing too much nutrition. His mill storage areas are models of medieval preservation technology. Raised floors to prevent dampness, thick walls to maintain steady temperatures, careful ventilation to prevent mold. Come here, Master Edmund says, leading you to the back of the mill where massive wooden bins hold grain in various stages of processing. See this barley? It came in damp from the fields. We let it dry properly before grinding. Wet grain makes poor flour and spoils quickly. And this wheat here, it's from last year's harvest, mixed careful-like with this year's crop. The old grain gives flavor, the new grain gives freshness. He shows you techniques that have been refined over generations. How to test grain for moisture by listening to the sound it makes when dropped, how to spot the early signs of insect damage, how to blend different grains to create flour that will make bread rise properly even when the wheat isn't perfect. Each piece of knowledge represents years of experience, small discoveries passed down from miller to miller like precious heirlooms. But perhaps most importantly, Master Edmund serves as an unofficial banker for the village's grain economy. Families who find themselves with extra grain can leave it at the mill, to be ground as needed throughout the season. Those who run short can often arrange to receive flour, now in exchange for grain from next year's harvest. These aren't formal loans with written contracts, but agreements based on trust and mutual dependence that bind the community together. The mill also serves as an early warning system for the village's food security. Master Edmund can see trends that individual families might miss. The overall reduction in grain coming through the mill, the shift toward cheaper grains like barley and oats, the increase in families bringing in grain more frequently but in smaller amounts. When he notices these patterns, he quietly alerts the village elders, helping them prepare for potential shortages before they become crises. As the day wears on and the steady rhythm of the mill continues, you begin to appreciate the subtle ways Master Edmund manages the village's grain supply. He encourages families to grind smaller amounts more frequently, keeping their flour fresh and reducing waste. He advises on mixing grains to create more nutritious combinations. He even suggests which grains work best for different purposes, coarse meal for porridge, fine flour for bread, medium grinds for various cooking needs. The miller's house, attached to the mill itself, reflects his crucial role in village life. The pantry is well stocked not just with his own family's provisions, but with samples of every type of grain that passes through his stones. His wife is known throughout the village for her skill with different flours, and neighbors often come to her for advice on baking when they're working with unfamiliar grains or trying to make inferior flour produce acceptable bread. Children love to visit the mill, fascinated by the great wheel and the thunderous grinding of the stones. Master Edmund welcomes them, understanding that they're learning not just about milling, but about the careful management of resources that will serve them throughout their lives. He shows them how to judge the quality of flour by its color and texture, how to tell when grain has been ground to the perfect consistency, how the flow of grain must be adjusted as the stones wear and change over time. As evening approaches and the mill will slows to a stop, Master Edmund performs his daily ritual of checking and cleaning his equipment. The grinding stones must be dressed regularly, their surfaces carefully chiseled to maintain the proper texture for efficient grinding. The wooden gears and mechanisms need constant attention, adjustments, and repairs. The mill building itself requires ongoing maintenance to keep it weatherproof and structurally sound. But beyond the mechanical care, there's the deeper responsibility of stewardship. Master Edmund knows that his mill serves not just individual families, but the community's survival. In his hands rest the tools and knowledge that transform the village's harvest into daily bread. His decisions about tolls, his advice about storage, his management of grain flow through the community. All of these seemingly small choices add up to the difference between a village that thrives and one that merely survives. Walking home in the gathering dusk, your bag now heavy with fresh flour, you reflect on the quiet wisdom of the miller's craft. In the rhythm of the great wheel, in the patient grinding of stone against stone, in the careful balance of community need and individual survival, you've witnessed something profound, the way knowledge, skill, and compassion combine to sustain life itself. The miller's wisdom isn't flashy or dramatic. It's found in the steady turning of wheels, the careful measurement of grain, the quiet adjustments that ensure everyone has enough. It's the understanding that in times of scarcity, those who control essential resources bear the greatest responsibility for their community's well-being. And it's the recognition that true wealth isn't measured in what you can hoard, but in what you can help others preserve and share. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, the sound of the mill will continue in your memory. Not the frantic grinding of desperate times, but the steady, thoughtful rhythm of wisdom applied to the challenges of daily life. In that sound, you can hear the heartbeat of a community that endures, adapts, and thrives through the simple but profound practice of turning grain into sustenance, scarcity into sufficiency, and individual survival into collective strength. In cottage kitchens, the ancient arts of preservation began their quiet work, transforming the bounty of uncertain harvests into sustenance that could endure the long months ahead. You wake to the familiar sounds of preparation, the gentle thud of wooden mallets, the soft scraping of knives against cutting boards, the whispered conversations of women sharing knowledge passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. The morning air carries the mingled scents of wood smoke, drying herbs, and something deeper, the earthy smell of root vegetables being prepared for storage, the tang of fermenting cabbage, the sweet warmth of apples slowly transforming in the autumn sun. These are the perfumes of security, the aromatic promises that winter hunger can be held at bay through patience, skill, and the accumulated wisdom of countless seasons. Your mother and grandmother work side by side at the heavy wooden table that dominates your cottage's main room, their hands moving with the practiced efficiency of women who have fought this battle against time and spoilage many times before. Today, like every day this season, is a race against nature, capturing the harvest's gifts before they can slip away into rot and waste. The medieval peasants' approach to food preservation was born of absolute necessity. Without refrigeration, without the luxury of year-round fresh supplies, families had to master techniques that could transform perishable plenty into storable sustenance. Every apple, every head of cabbage, every precious piece of meat had to be evaluated, processed, and stored with care that bordered on reverence. "Come," your grandmother says, her voice soft with the authority of experience. "Help me with these apples." The table before you is covered with the fruit of the ancient tree behind your cottage. Some perfect, some blemished, some showing the first signs of decay. Nothing will be wasted, but each apple must find its proper destiny based on its condition. The perfect apples, firm and unblemished, will go into the root cellar, carefully wrapped in straw and arranged so they don't touch each other, stored properly in the cool, humid darkness below ground. These apples might last until spring, their sweetness a precious reminder of warmer days during the depths of winter. Your grandmother shows you how to examine each apple, looking for the tiny brown spots that signal the beginning of decay, feeling for the subtle softness that means an apple won't store well. The slightly damaged apples follow a different path. These will be peeled, cored, and sliced into thin rings, then strung on long threads and hung from the cottage rafters to dry. The process seems almost ceremonial, the careful spiral of peel falling away to reveal the white flesh beneath, the rhythmic motion of the knife creating uniform slices, the patient threading of apple rings like prayer beads on a string. See how we cut them? Your mother explains, her knife moving with practiced precision. Not too thick, or they won't dry properly. Not too thin, or they'll break when we string them. Just right, so the air can move through them and draw out the moisture. This knowledge, gained through trial and error over countless seasons, represents the difference between success and failure in the preservation process. The damaged and overripe apples receive their own treatment. These will be cooked down into a thick, sweet paste that can be formed into cakes and dried until hard. These apple cakes, wrapped in cloth and stored carefully, will keep for months, providing sweetness and nutrition when fresh fruit is just a memory. Nothing edible is discarded. Even the peels and cores will be boiled to make a weak cider or used to feed the family's pig. But apples are just one small part of the preservation symphony playing out in cottage kitchens throughout the village. In the corner of your main room, a large wooden barrel holds cabbage, leaves being transformed through the ancient art of fermentation. The cabbage was harvested at just the right moment, after the first light frost but before the heavy freezes, and prepared according to methods that stretch back to time immemorial. The process began days ago with the careful selection of the best heads, their outer leaves removed, their hearts shredded with sharp knives into uniform pieces. The shredded cabbage was then layered in the barrel with coarse salt, each layer pressed down firmly to draw out the moisture and create the airless environment that fermentation requires. Now, covered with a weighted cloth and left to work its quiet magic, the cabbage is transforming into sauerkraut, a source of nutrition that will help prevent the winter sickness that comes when fresh foods disappear. Your grandmother lifts the cloth to check the fermenting cabbage, nodding with satisfaction at the sharp, clean smell that rises from the barrel. "It's working well," she says. "See how the brine has risen? That's what protects it from spoiling. As long as the cabbage stays under the liquid, it will keep all winter and into spring." This ancient process, requiring no ingredients beyond cabbage, salt, and thyme, represents one of humanity's most important discoveries: the ability to preserve fresh vegetables without cooking or drying. Outside in the small yard behind your cottage, other preservation activities continue under the careful supervision of the family's women. Strings of onions hang from wooden frames, their papery skins rustling in the breeze as they cure in the autumn sun. Properly dried onions could last through the winter, their sharp flavor a welcome addition to the monotonous diet of stored grains and preserved foods that would sustain the family through the cold months. Herbs hang in neat bundles from every available rafter and beam: sage for seasoning and medicine, thyme for preserving meat, rosemary for both flavor and its ability to ward off insects. Each herb was gathered at the perfect moment in its growing cycle, when its essential oils were at their peak, then carefully dried to preserve both flavor and medicinal properties. The knowledge of when and how to harvest these plants represented centuries of accumulated wisdom, passed down from mother to daughter in an unbroken chain of survival. The preservation of meat required different techniques and greater urgency. When a pig was slaughtered, the entire community might be involved in processing the carcass before any of it could spoil. Some cuts would be eaten fresh, but most would need to be preserved through smoking, salting, or a combination of both methods. In the small smokehouse behind the cottage, strips of pork hang from wooden poles, slowly curing in the aromatic smoke of oak and apple wood. The fire below burns constantly but low, producing smoke rather than intense heat, gradually drawing moisture from the meat while infusing it with flavors that both preserve and enhance it. The process requires constant attention. Too much heat and the meat cooks rather than cures, too little and it spoils before the preservation process is complete. Salt, precious and expensive, is used sparingly but effectively. The choice cuts of pork are packed in coarse salt, the crystals drawing out moisture, and creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that cause spoilage. After days in the salt cure, the meat will be rinsed and hung to air dry, developing the hard exterior that will protect the preserved flesh within. Even humble vegetables receive careful attention in the preservation process. Turnips and parsnips are layered in boxes with sand, the fine grains protecting them from moisture and frost. Carrots are buried in pits lined with straw, their natural sugars helping them survive the winter cold. Beans and peas, dried on their vines until they rattle in their pods, are shelled and stored in sealed clay pots, their protein-rich seeds representing security against winter hunger. The root cellar beneath your cottage is the heart of the family's preservation system. Dug deep into the earth where temperatures remain constant and cool, the cellar provides the perfect environment for storing vegetables, preserved foods, and the precious brewing vessels that turn grain into ale and fruit into wine. The walls are lined with shelves holding clay pots, wooden barrels, and woven baskets, each container carefully sealed and labeled with marks that identify their contents. Root vegetables nestle in beds of sand and straw, their living flesh continuing to breathe slowly in the cool darkness. Cabbages hang from hooks driven into the ceiling beams, their outer leaves protecting the tender hearts within. Barrels of salted fish, when available, sit alongside crocks of preserved eggs, packed in salt or lime water to extend their usefulness through the winter months. The women of the village share their preservation knowledge freely, understanding that everyone's survival depends on everyone's success. Recipes and techniques pass from cottage to cottage through informal networks of assistance and advice. When someone discovers a new method or improves an old one, the knowledge spreads quickly through the community, tested and refined by multiple households. Children learn these skills through observation and participation, their small hands helping with simple tasks while their eyes and ears absorb the complex web of knowledge that makes preservation possible. They learn to recognize the signs of successful fermentation, to judge when fruit is ready for drying, to understand the delicate balance of salt, time, and temperature that transforms fresh food into preserved sustenance. As the afternoon wears on, you help carry finished products to their storage locations. Strings of dried apples to the cottage loft, crocks of fermented vegetables to the root cellar, bundles of herbs to the dry corner where they'll wait for winter's need. Each item represents hours of careful work, but also hope for the future, confidence that the family's needs have been anticipated and provided for. The evening meal includes samples of preserved foods from previous seasons, dried fruit reconstituted in warm water, pickled vegetables that add sharp flavor to simple grains, herbs that transform plain porridge into something approaching abundance. These tastes serve as both reminder and promise. Reminder of successful preservation from the past, promise that this season's work will yield similar security. As darkness falls and the day's preservation work comes to an end, you reflect on the quiet heroism of these domestic arts. In the patient work of drying, salting, fermenting, and storing, you've witnessed humanity's ancient struggle against hunger and want. These techniques, refined over generations of necessity, represent triumph over the tyranny of seasons, the conquest of time itself through knowledge, skill, and careful planning. The preserved foods filling your cottage's storage spaces aren't just sustenance, they're security, comfort, and hope made manifest. In every dried apple ring, every crock of sauerkraut, every smoked piece of meat, lies the promise that winter's hardships can be endured, that the family will survive to see another spring, another harvest, another season of plenty. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, the scents of preservation linger in the air around you. The sweet smell of drying fruit, the sharp tang of fermentation, the smoky richness of cured meat. These are the perfumes of survival, the aromatic evidence of humanity's refusal to surrender to the limitations of nature. In their quiet presence, you find the deepest comfort of all, the knowledge that careful work today creates security for tomorrow, that the ancient arts of preservation continue their eternal work of transforming abundance into endurance, harvest into hope. Behind the hedge witch's cottage, plants grew in careful rows, each one placed with the precision of a prayer and the wisdom of generations. You walk the narrow path between the raised beds in the early morning light, your footsteps soft on the packed earth, breathing in air perfumed with mint and sage, chamomile, and lavender. Here, in this quiet sanctuary, the village's most precious knowledge grows in green abundance. The ancient understanding of how plants can heal, nourish, and sustain life when food becomes scarce. Dame Margot tends her garden with the same careful attention a scribe gives to illuminated manuscripts. Each plant a letter in an alphabet of healing that she learned from her grandmother, who learned it from hers. Her weathered hands move among the herbs with practiced gentleness, checking for signs of disease, harvesting leaves at the perfect moment, whispering words of gratitude that might be prayers or might simply be the habit of a woman who has spent her life in conversation with growing things. The garden itself tells the story of medieval survival, not through grand gestures or dramatic cures, but through the quiet accumulation of small remedies, gentle treatments, and nutritional supplements that could mean the difference between health and sickness, between thriving and merely enduring. In times when food grows scarce and bodies grow weak, the healer's garden becomes a second harvest, one that feeds not just the body but the spirit of hope itself. "Come," Dame Margot says, her voice carrying the soft authority of someone whose knowledge has saved lives. "Let me show you what the earth provides for those who know how to ask." She leads you first to a patch of pale green leaves that seem to glow in the morning light. "Nettle," she explains, though you already know to be wary of its sting. "Folks see it as a weed, but it's one of our most powerful allies when the body grows weak from poor eating." The nettle patch represents something profound about medieval healing, the understanding that the most powerful medicines often hide in the most humble places. These stinging plants, growing wild in every waste corner and abandoned lot, contain more iron and nutrition than most of the foods that grace the peasant table. When properly prepared, boiled until the sting disappears, nettle provides the green strength that bodies crave when winter stores run low and fresh food becomes a memory. Dame Margot shows you how to harvest nettle safely, using thick gloves and sharp shears to cut the tender tops before the plants flower and grow tough. "Take only what you need," she says, "and never take more than half from any plant. The nettle must live to give again tomorrow." This principle, taking only what's needed while ensuring the source remains strong, governs everything in the healer's world. Moving deeper into the garden, you encounter plants whose names carry the weight of centuries. Feverfew for headaches and women's troubles, calendula for wounds that won't heal properly, yarrow for bleeding and digestive complaints. Each plant occupies its perfect spot in the garden's careful design. Sun lovers basking in the bright patches, shade preferers tucked beneath the spreading branches of an ancient elder tree, water lovers clustered near the small stream that provides the garden's lifeblood. The elder tree itself stands like a grandmother watching over the garden, its gnarled branches heavy with clusters of dark berries that will soon ripen into one of autumn's most precious gifts. Elderberries, Dame Margot explains, are nature's own protection against the winter sickness that comes when cold weather and poor nutrition weaken the body's defenses. The berries can be made into syrups, wines, or simply cooked into thick jams that provide both sweetness and strength during the darkest months. "The old one's new," Dame Margot says, reaching up to touch an elder branch with reverence. "They planted these trees near every cottage, every healing place. The elder gives bark for pain, flowers for fever, berries for strength. A whole pharmacy in one tree, if you know how to use it properly." Her words carry the weight of accumulated wisdom, the kind of knowledge that can't be learned from books, but must be absorbed through years of careful observation and practice. The herb garden follows ancient patterns of organization that make both practical and spiritual sense. Plants with similar properties grow near each other, creating communities of healing that seem to strengthen each other's virtues. The digestive herbs, mint, fennel, dill, cluster in one sunny corner, their similar needs for warmth and light making them natural companions. The wound-healing plants, comfrey, plantain, self-heal, occupy a patch near the garden's entrance, ready for quick harvest when accidents happen. Dame Margot's knowledge extends far beyond simple plant identification. She understands the complex timing that governs herbal medicine, when to harvest each plant for maximum potency, how to dry them properly to preserve their healing properties, how to combine different herbs to create remedies more powerful than any single plant could provide. This knowledge represents generations of careful experimentation, of successes and failures passed down through an unbroken chain of healers. "See this chamomile?" she says, kneeling beside a patch of small, daisy-like flowers. "Most folk think it's just for tea, something pretty to drink before bed. But it's much more than that." She shows you how to identify the true chamomile by its sweet apple scent, how to distinguish it from similar-looking plants that lack its healing properties. The flowers, she explains, can soothe upset stomachs when food is poor or scarce, can ease the anxiety that comes with uncertainty, can help children sleep when hunger keeps them restless. The garden's design reveals the healer's deep understanding of both plants and people. Near the cottage door grow the emergency herbs, those needed quickly when accidents happen or sudden illness strikes. Plantain, the soldier's herb, spreads its broad leaves in easy reach, ready to be chewed and applied to cuts and scrapes. Comfrey, with its ability to speed the healing of broken bones and torn flesh, occupies a prominent spot where it can be found even in darkness. Deeper in the garden grow the plants needed for longer-term treatment, the herbs that build strength slowly, that support the body through extended periods of stress or poor nutrition. Dandelion, dismissed by many as a weed, provides bitter greens that stimulate digestion and help the body make the most of whatever food is available. Its roots, dried and roasted, make a coffee-like beverage that supports liver function when the body must work hard to extract nutrition from poor-quality food. Dame Margot's understanding of nutrition through plants reveals itself in every corner of the garden. She knows which herbs provide iron when meat is scarce, which ones offer the green vitamins that prevent scurvy during long winters, which ones help the body digest and absorb nutrients from coarse grains and preserved foods. This knowledge developed long before anyone understood vitamins or minerals, represents humanity's intuitive understanding of what bodies need to survive and thrive. The medicinal garden also serves as a teaching ground, where Dame Margot passes her knowledge to younger women who show aptitude for healing work. You watch as she guides a teenage girl through the process of harvesting and preparing herbs, her patient explanations covering not just the technical aspects, but the deeper wisdom of working with plants. The plants want to help us, she tells her student, her words carrying the mystical understanding that underlies all effective herbal medicine. But we must approach them with respect, take only what we need, and use their gifts wisely. A plant harvested in anger or greed will not heal as well as one gathered with gratitude and reverence. This attitude, part practical wisdom and part spiritual practice, shapes every aspect of the healer's work. The preparation of herbal medicines requires its own set of skills, passed down through generations of healers. Dame Margot shows you the small building attached to her cottage where herbs are dried, processed, and transformed into healing preparations. Bundles of herbs hang from every rafter, their leaves rustling softly in the warm air that rises from the small fire kept burning to aid the drying process. Long wooden tables hold mortars and pestles of various sizes, each used for grinding different types of plant material. Clay pots and glass bottles line the shelves, containing tinctures, oils, and powdered herbs prepared according to recipes that have proven their worth over centuries of use. The air itself seems saturated with healing, the concentrated essence of dozens of medicinal plants creating an atmosphere of comfort and hope. The process of making herbal tinctures reveals the medieval healer's sophisticated understanding of extraction techniques. Dame Margot demonstrates how different plants require different approaches. Some give up their healing properties best to water, others to wine or strong spirits, still others to oil or fat. The choice of extraction method can mean the difference between an effective medicine and a useless brew. This willow bark, she explains, holding up a piece of silvery bark, gives us its pain-relieving gift best when simmered gently in water for a long time. But this St. John's wort, she indicates bright yellow flowers steeping in a jar of oil, prefers to give its healing to oil slowly in the warm sun. Each plant has its own preferences, its own way of sharing what it offers. The healer's garden also provides for the community's nutritional needs when regular food sources fail. Wild garlic, growing in a shaded corner, adds both flavor and nutrition to thin soups and porridges. Chickweed, tender and mild, provides fresh greens when cultivated vegetables are no longer available. Lamb's quarters, another plant dismissed as a weed, offers leaves more nutritious than many cultivated crops. Dame Margot's knowledge extends to the emotional and spiritual aspects of healing, understanding that hunger and hardship affect more than just the body. She points out herbs like lemon balm and lavender, plants that can lift the spirits and ease the anxiety that comes with uncertain times. The heart needs healing too, she says, especially when times are hard and the future seems uncertain. As the day progresses, you help Dame Margot with the quiet work of the healer's garden, harvesting herbs at their peak potency, preparing them for drying and storage, organizing the previous season's medicines according to their uses and potency. The work requires patience, attention to detail, and a deep respect for the plants that make healing possible. The evening finds you helping to prepare herbal teas for families in the village. Gentle blends that will help children sleep despite empty bellies. Digestive aids for adults struggling with the coarse foods of late harvest. Strengthening tonics for the elderly whose bodies need extra support through difficult times. Each preparation is made with specific families in mind, tailored to their particular needs and circumstances. As night falls over the healer's garden, Dame Margot performs her evening ritual of gratitude, walking among her plants with words of thanks for their continued service. The garden seems to listen, its leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze, its scents growing stronger in the cooling air. Here, in this sanctuary of growing wisdom, the ancient partnership between humans and plants continues its quiet work of healing and hope. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you carry with you the peaceful certainty of the healer's garden. The knowledge that even in the most difficult times, the earth provides not just food for the body, but medicine for the spirit. In every carefully tended plant, in every ancient recipe, in every gentle preparation, lies humanity's enduring faith that healing is always possible, that wisdom grows as surely as herbs in good soil, and that the partnership between human need and natural abundance will continue as long as there are healers willing to tend the sacred ground where medicine grows. Even in uncertain times, children found ways to laugh and learn, their voices carrying across the village like birdsong, bright notes of hope that reminded everyone why the struggle for survival mattered. You watch from your cottage doorway as a group of young ones gathers in the common area between houses, their energy undimmed by the concerns that weigh heavy on adult minds. In their games and play, ancient wisdom passes from one generation to the next, disguised as entertainment, but carrying within it all the skills needed for survival. Little Emma, barely 6 summers old, crouches beside a puddle left by yesterday's rain, her small hands busy with something that looks like mere child's play, but is actually one of humanity's oldest learning methods. She's making mud pies, but not the aimless creations adults might imagine. Instead, she's carefully forming small rounds of clay-rich earth, patting them into shape with the same motions her mother uses when making real bread. The proportions are surprisingly accurate, the technique remarkably similar to the actual work she observes daily in her family's kitchen. "Look," she calls to her younger brother. "This one's got nuts in it, like mother makes for feast days." She presses small pebbles into her mud creation, unknowingly practicing the hand movements, the spatial reasoning, and the understanding of proportions that will serve her when she begins helping with actual bread making in just a few years. The game teaches patience, attention to detail, and the satisfaction of creating something useful. All essential skills for a medieval child's future. Nearby, a group of slightly older children engages in a game that appears to be simple entertainment, but actually serves as training for one of medieval life's most crucial skills. They're playing Market Day, with some children acting as merchants, others as customers, and still others as the goods being traded. Young Thomas holds a handful of acorns, seriously negotiating their exchange for the pile of colored stones that represents grain in their imaginary marketplace. "These acorns are from the old oak by the mill," he announces with the gravity of an experienced trader. "They're the best ones, no wormholes, perfect for pig feed." His customer, 9-year-old Sarah, examines the acorns with exaggerated care, learning through play the critical skill of evaluating goods for quality. A skill that could mean the difference between a good trade and a poor one in the real market that governs adult life. The game continues with elaborate negotiations over prices, quality, and quantities. The children instinctively understand the concepts of fair exchange, the importance of reputation in trading relationships, and the need to be both honest and shrewd in business dealings. They're learning mathematics without numbers, economics without formal instruction, and social skills that will serve them throughout their lives. In another corner of the common area, several girls have created an elaborate game around caring for babies, bundles of rags wrapped to resemble infants. But this isn't simple doll play. The girls discuss the baby's needs with sophisticated understanding of infant care, debate remedies for imaginary illnesses using knowledge absorbed from watching their mothers and the village healer, and practice the gentle but firm handling required for real childcare. "This one has the fever," declares 10-year-old Agnes, holding her rag bundle with careful tenderness. "We need to make willow bark tea and keep her cool." Her playmate nods seriously and pretends to gather herbs, reciting the correct preparation methods she's observed Dame Margot demonstrating. Through this play, the girls are learning not just childcare techniques, but the herbal knowledge that every medieval woman needed to keep her family healthy. The boys, meanwhile, have organized themselves into a complex game that mirrors the agricultural work dominating adult life. Using sticks as plows and small stones as seeds, they're farming a patch of bare earth near the village well. The game includes realistic discussions of weather patterns, crop rotation, and soil quality. Knowledge they've absorbed through years of observing their fathers and older brothers at work. The barley goes here where the soil is sandy, young Peter explains to his companions, unknowingly demonstrating sophisticated understanding of how different crops thrive in different conditions. And we'll put the beans next to it. Father says they help each other grow. The boy is learning permaculture principles developed over generations of trial and error, wisdom that will serve him when he takes over responsibility for his family's fields. The children's games often incorporate songs and rhymes that seem like simple entertainment, but actually serve as mnemonic devices for preserving important information. A group of mixed-age children chants a rhythmic verse while jumping over a rope. Nettle in spring for strength and vigor, elder in autumn makes bodies bigger, willow for pain, when bones do ache, chamomile tea for sleep's sweet sake. The rhyme, passed down through generations of children, preserves essential herbal knowledge in a format that's easy to remember and enjoyable to recite. By the time these children reach adulthood, the medicinal properties of common plants will be as familiar to them as their own names, embedded in memory through the pleasure of childhood play. Even seemingly aimless activities serve educational purposes in the medieval child's world. A group of young ones throwing stones at a target aren't just playing. They're developing the hand-eye coordination needed for everything from accurate sowing of seeds to the use of slings for protecting crops from birds and small animals. The children who consistently hit the target earn respect from their peers, learning that skill and practice bring social rewards. The seasonal nature of many games mirrors the agricultural calendar that governs adult life. In autumn, children play elaborate games of gathering and storing, mimicking their parents' urgent work to prepare for winter. They create tiny granaries from twigs and stones, practice the careful sorting that separates good nuts from bad ones, and compete to see who can preserve the most imaginary food for winter storage. Winter games focus on indoor skills and crafts. Children practice spinning thread using miniature wheels carved by village craftsmen, learning the finger movements and rhythm that will eventually allow them to contribute to textile production. They weave tiny baskets from grass and twigs, developing the manual dexterity needed for countless domestic tasks. They even practice the storytelling traditions that help communities survive long winter evenings, taking turns reciting tales and competing to remember the longest stories with the greatest accuracy. Spring brings games that celebrate renewal and growth. Children plant tiny gardens using seeds saved from adult projects, learning through experience about germination, spacing, and care of young plants. They compete to see whose seedlings grow fastest and strongest, absorbing lessons about soil preparation, watering, and plant nutrition that will serve them throughout their lives. The competitive aspect of many children's games serves important social and educational functions. Contests of skill, knowledge, and endurance teach children about fair play, gracious winning and losing, and the importance of continuous improvement. A child who wins a plant identification contest earns genuine respect from peers, creating positive associations with learning and knowledge. Adults encourage and guide children's games without overtly instructing, understanding that lessons learned through play are often more deeply absorbed than those taught through formal instruction. A father might casually mention the correct way to evaluate grain quality while watching children play market, or a mother might softly correct a child's technique while observing pretend bread making, allowing the lessons to emerge naturally from the play experience. The games also serve as subtle assessment tools, allowing adults to identify children who show particular aptitudes for various skills. A child who consistently demonstrates accuracy in measurement games might be steered toward eventual apprenticeship with the miller. One who shows special talent for plant identification and care might be encouraged to spend more time with the village healer. Through play, children reveal their natural inclinations and abilities, helping the community identify future craftspeople, healers, and leaders. Even the most rambunctious games serve educational purposes. Tag and chase games develop the physical fitness and quick reflexes needed for agricultural work and daily survival. Wrestling and tumbling build strength and body awareness. Dancing games, often performed to traditional songs, preserve cultural knowledge while developing coordination and rhythm that will enhance work efficiency in adulthood. The social aspects of children's games mirror the cooperative structures of adult village life. Games require negotiation, compromise, and mutual support. Children learn to include younger playmates, to share resources fairly, and to resolve conflicts peacefully. They practice the interpersonal skills that will make them valuable community members as adults. As the afternoon light begins to fade, you watch the children's games gradually wind down, their energy finally beginning to match the approaching end of day. But even in these quieter moments, learning continues. The children help each other clean up their play areas, practice the courtesy and mutual aid that characterize village life, and begin the transition toward evening routines that mirror adult patterns of rest and preparation. Young Emma carefully dismantles her mud kitchen, returning the clay to the puddle and stones to their original locations. Without being told, she understands the importance of leaving spaces clean for others to use, demonstrating environmental awareness and social responsibility learned through observation and gentle guidance. The older children organize the putting away of shared play materials: the rope for jumping, the sticks used as tools, the stones that served as currency in their trading games. They negotiate fairly about whose turn it is to carry things, who gets to be first tomorrow, and how to settle minor disputes that arose during play. These negotiations, though they concern seemingly trivial matters, are teaching the children conflict resolution skills they'll need throughout their lives. As evening settles over the village and children drift toward their family cottages, you reflect on the profound wisdom embedded in their seemingly simple play. Every game, every song, every pretend activity has prepared them a little more for the real challenges they'll face as adults. Through the pleasure of play, they've absorbed knowledge that might have been difficult to learn through formal instruction, developed skills that will serve them throughout their lives, and strengthen the social bonds that will support them in times of need. The children's laughter may have faded with the daylight, but the learning continues even as they sleep, their minds processing and consolidating the lessons hidden within their games. Tomorrow will bring new play, new learning, and new opportunities to practice the skills that will ensure not just their individual survival, but the continuation of their community's accumulated wisdom. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, the echo of children's voices reminds you that even in the most uncertain times, the future is being carefully prepared through the simple but profound medium of play. In every game, every song, every moment of childhood joy, the essential knowledge of survival and community passes from one generation to the next, ensuring that the wisdom of the ages will endure no matter what challenges tomorrow might bring. The weekly market square hummed with a different energy now. Where once the cheerful chaos of abundance had filled the cobblestones with laughter and easy bargaining, a quieter, more purposeful rhythm had taken hold. The familiar faces were all still there: Martha with her baskets of eggs, young Thomas hauling sacks of barely sprouted turnips, old Henrik with his carefully counted bundles of kindling. But something had shifted in the very air itself. You pull your woolen cloak tighter against the morning chill as you make your way between the wooden stalls. The mist hasn't quite lifted from the market square, giving everything a soft, dreamlike quality. Your own small bundle weighs heavy in your arms. 3 precious wheels of cheese that your family had been saving, now to be traded for things more essential than the coins that had grown scarce. Let us settle into this gentle scene, dear listener, and discover how these resourceful people adapted their ancient traditions of trade and community when abundance gave way to careful conservation. The market bell still rang at dawn, just as it had for generations beyond counting. But now, instead of rushing to claim the best spots and the choicest goods, people moved with a more measured pace. There was wisdom in this slower rhythm. No need to hurry when everyone understood that what mattered most was not getting the best deal, but making sure everyone got what they needed. Sarah the baker arrived with smaller loaves than usual, but each one was dense with nutrition, barley and oat mixed with the precious wheat, stretched with ground acorns and chestnuts that the village children had gathered in autumn. Her bread was darker now, heartier, and somehow more satisfying than the pale, white loaves of easier times. She arranged them carefully on her cloth, each one representing hours of careful kneading and the precise rationing of her dwindling flour stores. Fresh bread baked before dawn, she called, but softly, without the boisterous enthusiasm of summer markets. There was something more intimate about her voice now, as if she were speaking to friends rather than customers. And indeed, that's exactly what these people were. Neighbors who had known each other through christenings and harvests, through weddings and winter storms. Young Peter the shepherd boy had driven his small flock the 3 miles from the hillside pastures. But today he brought only 2 sheep for sale instead of his usual half-dozen. These were carefully chosen, older ewes whose wool-bearing days were behind them, selected with the wisdom his grandfather had taught him about preserving the future of the flock while meeting present needs. The sheep clustered close to Peter's legs, their breath visible in small puffs in the cool air. He stroked their woolly backs absently, a gesture of both comfort and farewell. In easier times, selling sheep had been a matter of simple commerce. Now it felt more like a sacred trust. These animals would feed families through the lean months ahead. Where once silver pennies had clinked cheerfully from palm to palm, now the more ancient art of bartering had returned to fill the spaces between neighbors. But this wasn't the desperate haggling of desperate times. It was something far more graceful, a careful dance of mutual care disguised as commerce. Eleanor approached Martha's egg stall with a small clay pot in her hands. Inside, precious salt gleamed white as snow, salt that her late husband had traded for with coastal merchants the previous summer, when such luxuries had seemed endless. Now each grain was precious beyond measure, essential for preserving the last of the autumn meat. "Good morning, Martha," Eleanor said quietly, setting down her pot with gentle ceremony. "I was wondering if you might have need of some salt. My Thomas won't be coming home from his merchant travels until spring, and I find myself with more than I can use through winter." This was the polite fiction that allowed dignity to remain intact. Everyone knew that Eleanor's Thomas might not return at all. The roads had grown dangerous, and news traveled slowly in winter. Everyone also knew that Eleanor's salt reserves were probably running as low as everyone else's. But the gentle lie allowed Martha to offer a fair trade without either woman losing face. Martha lifted the lid of Eleanor's pot and inhaled deeply, closing her eyes as if the salt were the finest perfume. "Oh, this is lovely salt, Eleanor. Clean as mountain snow. I think I could spare a dozen eggs for such quality." She paused, as if making a difficult calculation. "Perhaps 15, if you could part with the whole pot." Both women knew this was more than generous. In normal times, such salt might have been worth only 6 or 7 eggs. But these weren't normal times, and normal calculations no longer applied. What mattered was that Eleanor would have protein for her family, and Martha would have the means to preserve the fish her son brought from the river. They shook hands solemnly, and Martha carefully selected the 15 finest eggs from her baskets, wrapping each one in soft moss before nestling them into Eleanor's own basket. No money changed hands, but something far more valuable had been exchanged. The promise that neighbors would care for neighbors, that no one would go hungry while others still had something to share. At the far end of the market square, where the stone merchant's hall cast its long shadow, a different kind of trading was taking place. Here, the traveling merchants who connected village to village, county to county, had adapted their ancient routes to the new realities of scarcity and careful conservation. Master Geoffrey had been walking these roads for 30 years, his sturdy cart pulled by an even sturdier mare named Patience. In summer markets, his cart had overflowed with exotic goods: spices from distant ports, fine cloth from London weavers, metal tools forged in Birmingham's workshops. Now his cart carried fewer luxuries but more essentials: salt from the coastal works, iron for the blacksmith's forge, seeds carefully saved from regions where the harvests had been kinder. He understood something that younger merchants had yet to learn: that in times of scarcity, trust became more valuable than gold. A reputation for fair dealing, for remembering which villages had treated him well in prosperous times, for carrying messages between separated families. These things mattered more than the precise weight of silver in his purse. "Good people," he called, not from his cart but standing among the villagers like one of their own. "I bring word from the northern counties. The harvest there was better than expected, not abundant but sufficient. And they have need of the fine wool your sheep produce. Perhaps we can arrange something beneficial to all." This was how Master Geoffrey worked now, not as an outsider extracting profit, but as a connector of communities, a weaver of the invisible threads that held the broader world together. He would take the village's excess wool north, and return with the surplus grain that might mean the difference between a hard winter and a devastating one. The villagers gathered around him, not with the eager curiosity of customers, but with the careful attention of partners in a shared enterprise. Questions were asked about families in other villages, about the conditions of roads and the safety of travel. Information flowed as freely as any goods, because knowledge, too, had become a currency of survival. While the adults conducted their careful negotiations, the market served as a different kind of classroom for the village children. They moved between the stalls like small, bright fish, absorbing lessons that no formal schooling could provide. Little Anne, barely 7 summers old, clung to her mother's skirts as they approached the cloth merchant's stall. But her eyes were busy, watching how her mother examined each bolt of fabric, feeling for the weight and weave that would indicate warmth and durability, checking for the subtle flaws that might mean a garment would fail when most needed. "See how the threads lie so evenly, Anne?" her mother whispered, letting the child's small fingers trace the pattern of the weave. "This will keep you warm through many winters. But this other cloth, see how it's thinner here? Pretty enough for summer, but not what we need now." The lesson was about more than cloth. It was about looking beneath surfaces, about understanding that beauty and practicality sometimes diverged, about making choices that would serve not just today but many tomorrows to come. Young William, the miller's son, had been given the responsibility of helping his father negotiate for the grain that other villages might spare. At 10 years old, he was learning to read the subtle signs, which farmers' faces showed true abundance, and which showed the careful hoarding of people who had just enough to share a little. He watched his father's hands as they sifted through samples of barley and oats, learning to judge quality by touch and smell, to spot the weevil damage that could ruin a winter's stores. But perhaps most importantly, he was learning the art of respectful negotiation, how to drive a fair bargain without driving it so hard that trust was broken, how to read the difference between someone who could afford to be generous and someone who was already giving more than they could spare. What an outsider might have seen as simple commerce was actually something far more complex and beautiful. A network of mutual care that operated through the familiar language of buying and selling. Each transaction carried within it a dozen small kindnesses, 100 tiny considerations for the welfare of neighbors and strangers alike. When Robert the blacksmith traded a set of iron nails for a sack of apples, both men knew that the nails were worth considerably more in any strict accounting. But Robert also knew that the apple merchant's orchard had suffered in the strange weather, and that the man's children were thin. The trade was actually a gift, disguised as commerce to preserve everyone's dignity. The apple merchant, for his part, had chosen his very finest fruit for Robert, apples that would keep well into winter, their crisp sweetness a reminder of summer's warmth during the darkest months. He had also whispered to Robert about a source of good charcoal 2 villages over, information that would help the blacksmith keep his forge burning when local fuel grew scarce. These layers of generosity and mutual aid wove through every transaction in the market. The herbalist who traded her healing teas for bread was actually providing medicine to families who couldn't afford to fall ill when every healthy hand was needed for winter survival. The carpenter who accepted half the usual payment for repairing a neighbor's roof knew that a warm, dry house would be worth more than silver when the cold winds came. Even the children participated in this web of care. They ran messages between stalls, their small legs quick and their memories sharp. They helped elderly neighbors carry heavy baskets, their young backs strong and their hearts generous. They sang the old songs while the adults worked, their voices bright threads weaving through the more serious business of survival. The market day had always followed the rhythm of the agricultural year, but now that rhythm had gained new meaning. In spring markets of easier times, people had bought seeds almost carelessly, choosing varieties for beauty as much as for sustenance. Now, every seed was chosen with the careful deliberation of someone whose life might depend on the choice. Master Edwin, the village's most experienced gardener, had set up a small stall with dozens of small cloth packets, each carefully labeled in his precise script. But these weren't just seeds. They were hope, distilled into tiny kernels of potential life. "These turnips," he explained to a young couple planning their first independent garden, "will grow even in poor soil, and the leaves are as nourishing as the roots. Plant them thick, and thin them for early greens while the roots swell for winter storage." He handed them the packet with the solemnity of someone passing on sacred knowledge. "And these beans," he continued, selecting another packet, "will put goodness back into your soil while feeding your family. Plant them where you grew your cabbages last year, and next year's crops will thank you for it." This was agricultural wisdom refined by generations of experience and sharpened by necessity. Every recommendation Edwin made carried within it the accumulated knowledge of people who had faced lean times before and lived to tell about it. The seasonal rhythm extended to every corner of the market. The potter offered sturdy crocks for storing preserved foods, rather than the decorative vessels of summer markets. The rope maker displayed his wares with detailed explanations of which knots would hold under stress, which weaves would last through multiple seasons of use. Even the entertainment had adapted to the times. The traveling storyteller still performed, but his tales now featured heroes who succeeded through cleverness and cooperation, rather than through martial prowess. His songs celebrated the quiet virtues of endurance and community care, rather than the loud glories of conquest and wealth. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about these transformed market days was what they revealed about human nature under pressure. Rather than the desperate competition that some might have expected, the scarcity had brought out a deeper wisdom. The understanding that individual survival was impossible without community survival. The wealthy merchant's widow, Dame Marguerite, arrived at market not in her usual fine dress, but wearing the practical wool of a working woman. Her servant carried not luxury goods but practical items from her well-stocked household: extra blankets, surplus preserves, household tools that her reduced staff no longer needed. She made her trades quietly, without fanfare, but everyone noticed that her prices were more than fair, her goods of the finest quality. She was using her accumulated wealth not to increase her advantage, but to help ensure that the community that had supported her prosperity would survive to prosper again. On the other side of the social spectrum, Jack the day laborer, who in easier times had barely scraped together enough coppers for his weekly bread, now found himself in the unusual position of having something valuable to offer. His strong back and willing hands had always been his only capital, but now that capital was precious beyond measure. He moved through the market offering his services: a day's work splitting firewood in exchange for a sack of grain, a week's labor helping to repair storm damage in return for a side of preserved pork. His weathered hands and bent back, marks of a lifetime of hard work, were now his ticket to security through the difficult months ahead. As the afternoon sun began to slant low across the market square, the familiar rhythm of closing time took on new meaning. In summer markets, closing time had often meant rushing to grab the last bargains, vendors calling out final offers, a general air of celebration as people headed home with their treasures. Now, the closing was more like a gentle benediction. People lingered, reluctant to end the connections that the market day had renewed. Conversations continued as stalls were packed away. Plans were made for mutual assistance through the week ahead. Promises were given and received with the solemnity of sacred vows. The market bell rang its final note of the day, but its echo seemed to carry further than usual, blessing not just the end of commerce, but the continuation of community. People gathered their purchases, smaller bundles than in easier times, but somehow more precious for being so carefully chosen and fairly traded. As you make your way home with your own small collection of treasures, a pot of honey traded for your cheese, a length of sturdy rope that will serve a dozen purposes, seeds for next year's garden that represent faith in the future. You carry with you something more valuable than any material goods. You carry the knowledge that you are part of something larger than yourself, a web of mutual care and ancient wisdom that has survived countless difficulties and will survive this one too. The market day has reminded you that prosperity isn't just about abundance. It's about the human capacity to share what we have, to adapt to what we must, and to find abundance in the simple fact of caring for one another. The market square grows quiet now, empty except for the pigeons pecking at scattered grain and the soft whisper of the evening wind through the wooden stalls. But the connections made here, the promises given and received, the small kindnesses exchanged, these will sustain the village through whatever challenges lie ahead. And as you settle into your evening rest, dear listener, let the gentle wisdom of these long-ago market days remind you that the most important transactions in life aren't measured in coins or goods, but in the currency of human kindness, carefully given and gratefully received. The market bell falls silent, but its message echoes still, that we are all traders in the great marketplace of human care, and the goods we offer each other are nothing less than hope itself, freely given and endlessly renewed. As twilight painted the cottage walls in shades of amber and rose, voices gathered around the fire like old friends returning home after a long journey. The workday was done, the animals fed and bedded down, the evening meal shared from bowls that had been carefully scraped clean, the last of the mending set aside for tomorrow's light. Now came the most precious hours of all, when the village came together not around the market stalls or the church pews, but around the ancient circle of firelight that had drawn human voices together since time beyond memory. You settle into your familiar spot on the wooden bench that your grandfather carved, feeling the smooth wear of countless evenings beneath your hands. The fire crackles softly in the stone hearth, its light dancing across the faces of neighbors who have become as familiar as family through these long months of shared struggle and quiet triumph. Tonight, like every night when the day's work is done, the time has come for the stories that bind a community together more surely than any law or custom. Old Henrik clears his throat gently, a sound that has become the village's evening bell, calling everyone to attention without demanding it. At 73 summers, he is the keeper of the longest memories, the holder of tales that stretch back to his grandfather's grandfather's time. His voice, weathered by decades of use but still strong and clear, begins to weave the first thread of the evening's tapestry. I was thinking today, he says, settling his gnarled hands around his cup of herb tea, about my great-grandfather's stories of the winter when the river froze so solid that oxen could walk across it. Folks thought it was the end of the world, but old Magnus, that was his name, Magnus used to tell how that winter taught the village something precious about making do with what you have. The children lean forward instinctively, their eyes bright with anticipation. Little Emma, barely 5 years old, curls closer to her mother's side, her small fingers playing with the edge of her woolen blanket. She has heard this story before, as have they all, but that's the beauty of the fireside tales. They grow richer with each telling, like wine that improves with age. Magnus was just a boy then, Henrik continues, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a practiced storyteller. But he remembered how his mother sent him and his brothers to gather every scrap of wood they could find. Not just from the forest, that was picked clean within a week, but from old broken furniture, from the ruins of the mill that had burned down 3 summers before, even from the wooden grave markers that had gotten so old nobody remembered who they marked. Young Thomas, the miller's son who has been learning the weight of adult responsibility these past months, speaks up from his corner near the door. But wasn't that wrong? Taking wood from graves? Henrik's eyes twinkle with approval at the question. This is how the stories do their work. Not by giving easy answers, but by opening up the kinds of questions that help young minds wrestle with the complexities of survival and conscience. That's exactly what young Magnus asked his mother, Henrik replies. And she told him something that stayed with him all his life. She said, "The dead don't need their markers to remember them. We carry them in our hearts and our stories. But if the living freeze, who will be left to tell those stories at all?" The fire pops softly, sending up a shower of tiny sparks that dance toward the smoke-darkened rafters. In that moment of gentle sound, everyone absorbs the lesson, that sometimes survival requires choices that aren't simply right or wrong, but something more complex, something that must be weighed against the deeper question of what serves life itself. Martha, the baker's wife, takes up the thread of the evening's weaving. Her stories usually come from a different well, not the ancient past, but the more recent memories of abundance and the wisdom learned in learning to live without it. Speaking of making do, she says, her voice warm with the hint of laughter that never quite leaves her speech. I was remembering today the story my own mother used to tell about the great honey shortage. This was maybe 20 years ago, when the wild bees all seemed to disappear at once. Nobody knew why. Some said it was the weather, others blamed it on the new crops someone had tried planting up north. The adults nod knowingly. They remember that year, or at least the echoes of it in their parents' careful rationing of sweetness. Honey had been precious always, but that year it had become more valuable than silver. Well, Martha continues, you know how children are about their sweet things. My little brother, he's got children of his own now. He was maybe 8 years old, and he was near to tears about not having honey for his morning bread. Mother listened to his complaints for about a week, and then she took him out to the garden where she'd been growing those big yellow flowers. What do we call them? Sunflowers, that's right. Little Emma pipes up from her mother's side. I know this story. She made honey from flowers. Martha laughs, the sound rich and comfortable as fresh bread. Not exactly honey, little one, but something just as sweet. She showed my brother how to take the flower heads after they'd finished blooming, and boil them down with just a touch of water until they made a syrup thick and golden as the honey the bees had stopped making. The story unfolds like a lesson in disguise. Martha describes how her mother had taught the whole village the art of making flower syrup, how the children had competed to see who could gather the most sunflower heads, how the crisis had become an adventure that brought everyone together around a shared discovery. The bees came back the next spring, Martha concludes, but we kept making flower syrup anyway. Not because we had to anymore, but because we'd learned that sometimes the solutions to our problems are growing right in our own gardens, waiting for us to be clever enough to see them. Eleanor, the widow whose husband Thomas had not returned from his trading journey, speaks next. Her voice carries a different quality than the others. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of deep quiet that comes from having learned to find strength in solitude. I was thinking about patience today, she says, her needlework continuing in her lap even as she talks. About the story of Saint Bridget and the butter that never ran out. Not because it was magic, mind you, but because she knew the secret of making a little go a long way. The religious stories wove through the evening conversations like golden threads through a tapestry. Not the formal, Latin-heavy tales of the church services, but the folk versions that had been worn smooth by countless retellings, polished until they gleamed with practical wisdom rather than formal doctrine. Bridget had a house full of guests one winter, Eleanor continues, and only one small pot of butter to last until spring. Now, she could have rationed it out in tiny portions, making everyone go without. Or she could have used it all up quickly, and then had nothing. But instead, she did something clever. The children are listening intently now, because Eleanor's stories usually come with lessons they can use in their own daily lives. Every morning, she would take just a small portion of the butter and warm it gently by the fire until it became soft and spreadable. Then she would mix it with a bit of fresh cream. Not much, mind you, just enough to make it light and airy. That one small portion of butter, treated with such care, would spread across twice as much bread as it would have if she'd just slapped it on cold and hard. Young William, who has been learning the arts of conservation from his father the miller, nods thoughtfully. So the miracle wasn't that the butter multiplied, he says slowly, but that she knew how to make it work harder. Eleanor smiles, the expression transforming her usually solemn face. Exactly right, William. The real miracle was understanding that with enough care and attention, a little can become plenty. The fire burns lower as the evening progresses, but no one moves to add more wood. This too is part of the rhythm they've learned. To let the fire gentle down gradually, to let the light slowly dim, to allow the stories to weave themselves toward sleep rather than toward excitement. Master Robert, the village carpenter, shifts in his chair and begins a tale that the adults have been waiting for all evening. His stories are different from the others, not ancient wisdom or recent memories, but the kind of tales that help people understand that their current struggles are not unique, that human beings have always found ways to endure and even flourish in difficult times. There was a village, he begins, his voice taking on the formal cadence of stories that have been polished by many tellings. Not so different from our own, that faced a winter when nothing seemed to go right. The harvest had been poor, the weather was harsh, and worst of all, the people had begun to turn against each other, each family hoarding what little they had and viewing their neighbors as competitors rather than companions. This is a story that carries special weight in these times, when the temptation to look inward, to protect only one's own family, must be constantly balanced against the deeper wisdom of community survival. The village elder, Robert continues, was a woman named Gwendolyn, and she watched this happening with great sadness. She knew that a village that turned against itself would not survive the winter, no matter how much food each family managed to hoard. So she devised a plan. The plan, as Robert tells it, was both simple and profound. Gwendolyn announced that every family in the village would contribute something to a great feast, not their best food, which they needed for survival, but something small that they could spare. The catch was that no family could eat their own contribution. Everyone would eat only what their neighbors had brought. At first, Robert says, people were suspicious. Why should they give away food that their own children needed? But Gwendolyn was clever. She made the contributions very small, just a handful of grain, a single egg, a cup of milk. Things that would barely be missed from family stores. But that together would make a feast large enough for the whole village. The story unfolds like a demonstration of mathematics, but mathematics of the heart rather than of the marketplace. As Robert describes the feast, his listeners can almost see it. The long wooden tables set up in the village square, the mixture of familiar and unfamiliar dishes, the gradual relaxation of suspicion as people realized that sharing a small amount had created abundance for everyone. But the real magic happened afterward, Robert continues. Because once people had eaten together, had shared that meal made from everyone's contributions, they began to see each other differently. The family across the lane wasn't competition anymore. They were the people who had contributed the barley that made the soup so filling. The widow at the end of the village wasn't a burden. She was the one whose herbs had made all the food taste so much better. Young Anne, who has been listening with the particular intensity that children bring to stories that they sense are really about them, raises her small hand. Did they keep having the feasts? Even after winter was over. Robert's smile is gentle and knowing. They did indeed, little one, because they had learned something that winter that they never forgot, that the best way to take care of your own family is to take care of everyone's family. The story settles into the room like a blessing, and for a few minutes no one speaks. The fire has burned down to glowing coals now, painting everything in soft red light that makes the familiar cottage seem like a place from a fairy tale. Dame Marguerite, the merchant's widow whose quiet generosity at the market has become one of the village's unspoken treasures, clears her throat softly. When she speaks, it's in the voice she reserves for her most precious memories. My husband used to tell a story, she says, about two merchants who set out on the same road with identical goods to sell. The first merchant hoarded his wares, selling them only for the highest prices, trusting no one, sharing nothing. The second merchant was generous with his samples, fair in his dealings, and quick to help when others faced troubles on the road. The story is familiar in outline. Tales of generous merchants and greedy ones are common around firesides everywhere. But Dame Marguerite tells it with the authority of someone who has lived the truth it contains. At the end of the year, she continues, both merchants counted their profits. The generous merchant had earned exactly the same amount of gold as the greedy one. But he had also earned something the other merchant could never purchase. He had friends and allies in every town along his route. When troubles came, as troubles always do, the generous merchant had a dozen places where he could find help, while the greedy merchant faced his difficulties alone. Little Emma has fallen asleep against her mother's side, her breathing soft and even. Her mother strokes her daughter's hair gently, but makes no move to carry her home. These evening gatherings are too precious to cut short, and the child will sleep just as well here by the dying fire as she would in her own bed. The stories continue, but they grow quieter now, more like lullabies than lessons. Henrik tells a brief tale about a talking cat who helped a poor family through a harsh winter by catching mice that had been stealing their grain stores. Martha shares a memory of her grandmother's garden, where somehow vegetables always grew larger and sweeter than anyone else's, not through magic, but through the simple expedient of talking to the plants as if they were dear friends. As the evening winds toward its gentle close, the stories become more personal, more immediate. People share small victories from the day just past, a successful trade at the market, a neighbor's child taking his first steps, the discovery of a patch of early mushrooms in the forest that promises good foraging in the weeks to come. These aren't stories in the formal sense, but they serve the same purpose as the ancient tales. They weave the individual experiences of community members into a shared narrative, a collective memory that belongs to everyone present. The fire burns down to embers, casting just enough light to see faces, but not enough to keep anyone fully awake. One by one, people begin to gather their belongings and make their quiet farewells. The evening doesn't end abruptly. It fades gradually, like the fire itself, with people drifting away when sleep calls them more strongly than the warmth of companionship. You are among the last to leave, reluctant to break the spell of contentment that these evening gatherings always weave. As you step out into the cool night air, you carry with you more than just the memory of stories told and heard. You carry the deeper knowledge that you are part of something larger than yourself, a community that sustains itself not just through shared labor and mutual aid, but through the shared stories that remind everyone who they are and why they matter. The cottage door closes behind you with a soft wooden whisper, but the stories continue to echo in your mind as you make your way home through the sleeping village. Tonight, like every night, the ancient human ritual of gathering around fire to share words and wisdom has renewed the bonds that hold the community together, has reminded everyone that individual survival depends on collective memory, and has planted the seeds of tomorrow's hope in the rich soil of shared experience. And as you settle into your own bed, dear listener, let these gentle voices from across the centuries remind you that the most important stories are not always the ones written in books, but the ones that pass from heart to heart around the fires of human fellowship, carrying within them all the wisdom our species has gathered about the arts of endurance, kindness, and hope. As twilight painted the cottage walls in shades of amber and gold, voices gathered around the fire like moths drawn to gentle flame. The day's work was done, the animals settled for the night, and the precious hours of storytelling had arrived. That sacred time when wisdom passed from old lips to young ears. When the community's memory was kept alive through tales told in the dancing light of burning wood. Old Henrik, the village's most treasured storyteller, settled into his familiar spot on the wooden bench closest to the hearth. His lined face caught the firelight, shadows playing across features that had weathered countless seasons of joy and hardship. Around him, 3 generations of his family arranged themselves on stools and cushions, their faces turned expectantly toward the man whose voice could transform an ordinary evening into something magical. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars returning to their celestial home. The cottage felt warm and secure, a refuge from the growing darkness outside and the uncertainty that seemed to press against the village like a gathering storm. In this circle of firelight, surrounded by the people he loved most, Henrik prepared to share the stories that had sustained his people through difficult times before. "Tell us about the Great Hunger, grandfather," whispered young Emma, Henrik's granddaughter, her wide eyes reflecting the flames. "Tell us how our great-great-grandmother survived when the rains wouldn't stop." Henrik nodded slowly, understanding that this request was more than simple curiosity. The children sensed, as children always do, that something was changing in their world. They had heard the quiet conversations between adults, noticed the careful way grain was being measured, felt the subtle tension that accompanies uncertainty. Tonight, they needed to hear that their people had faced such challenges before and emerged stronger. "Ah, little Emma," Henrik began, his voice carrying the cadence of countless tellings. "That was a time much like this one, when the sky forgot how to behave properly, and the earth grew confused about what it was supposed to produce." The family leaned closer, drawn into the ancient rhythm of oral tradition. Even the adults, who had heard these stories many times before, found comfort in the familiar words, in the reminder that their current struggles were part of a larger pattern, that survival was woven into their very heritage. "Your great-great-grandmother Marta was just a young woman then," Henrik continued, "newly married to your great-great-grandfather Thomas, trying to make a life in a world that seemed determined to test every plan they made. The rains came in the spring and never truly stopped, turning the fields into lakes and the roads into rivers of mud." As Henrik spoke, his listeners could almost see that long-ago landscape, could imagine the relentless gray skies and the waterlogged earth that refused to nurture the crops upon which everything depended. The story was told not with dramatic flourishes, but with the steady, comforting rhythm of truth shared between people who understood that hardship was part of life's fabric. "But Marta was clever, like all the women in our family," Henrik said with a gentle smile toward his daughter and granddaughter. "She knew that when the usual foods became scarce, a wise person looked elsewhere for sustenance. She learned which roots could be gathered from the forest floor, which berries ripened even in cloudy weather, which herbs could be dried and stored to stretch the winter's provisions." Emma's mother, Sarah, stirred the coals with an iron poker, sending fresh flames dancing upward. She had heard this story countless times, but tonight it felt different, more immediate. The wisdom embedded in her ancestors' struggles seemed directly relevant to their current situation. "Marta also understood something that kept the whole village alive," Henrik continued, his voice growing warmer with the memory of ancestral wisdom. "She knew that survival was not a task for one person alone, but something that required every hand, every heart, every bit of knowledge that the community could gather together." The old man described how Marta had organized the village women to share their foraging knowledge, how they had worked together to preserve and distribute whatever food they could find or grow. He told of evening gatherings much like this one, where recipes were exchanged, where the old women taught the young ones which plants were safe to eat and which should be avoided, where hope was maintained through the simple act of planning for better days ahead. "The hardest part," Henrik said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "was not the hunger itself, but the fear that it might never end." But Marta learned something important during those difficult months. She learned that when people take care of each other, when they share not just their food but their knowledge and their hope, they become stronger than any hardship that tries to break them. As the fire burned lower and the cottage grew drowsy with warmth, Henrik's story wound toward its gentle conclusion. He spoke of the eventual return of normal weather, of harvests that filled the granaries once again, of children born into better times who carried forward the wisdom their parents had gained through struggle. "And that," Henrik concluded, reaching out to touch Emma's hand, "is why we tell these stories. Not to frighten, but to remind ourselves that we come from people who knew how to endure, who understood that every storm eventually passes, who never forgot that the strength to survive lies not in what we store in our granaries, but in what we carry in our hearts. The fire settled into glowing coals, and one by one, the family members began to drift toward their beds, carrying with them the comfort of ancestral wisdom and the quiet certainty that they, too, would find ways to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. Snow fell like a soft blanket, muffling the world in white silence that seemed to press against the cottage windows with gentle insistence. Inside, the Miller family had drawn closer together, both physically and spiritually, as the coldest months demanded the kind of careful living that tested every resource they had managed to preserve through the strange harvest. John Miller sat by the single window, watching the endless dance of snowflakes against the gray afternoon sky. Each flake that fell meant another day that the stores would need to stretch, another night that the fire would need to burn, another morning that his family would wake to the quiet challenge of making do with less than they might wish. The cottage felt smaller in winter, but not uncomfortably so. The family had learned to find comfort in their proximity, in the shared warmth of bodies gathered around the central hearth, in the gentle rhythm of indoor activities that kept hands busy and minds occupied during the long, dark months when outdoor work was impossible. Margaret, John's wife, sat at the spinning wheel near the fire, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had turned wool into thread through dozens of winters. The gentle hum of the wheel provided a soothing counterpoint to the whisper of wind around the cottage corners, a sound that spoke of productivity even in the depths of winter's enforced rest. "Tell me again about the yarn we'll have," said little Mary, their youngest daughter, who sat at her mother's feet working with her own small spindle. At 7 years old, she was just learning the skills that would serve her throughout her life, but she took pride in contributing her small thread to the family's resources. "By spring," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the satisfaction of work well done, "we'll have enough for new shirts for your father and brother, and perhaps a bit extra to trade for what we need." The wheel continued its gentle revolution, transforming the wool they had carefully saved from their autumn sheep shearing into the thread that would become clothing, blankets, and trade goods. Young Thomas, now grown to 13 and shouldering more responsibility with each passing month, sat by the fire carving wooden bowls from blocks of oak his father had set aside for winter work. The rhythmic scraping of his knife against the wood created another layer in the cottage's symphony of productive sounds. "These will fetch a good price at spring market," John observed, examining his son's work with approval. "The grain may have been uncertain this year, but your hands are growing sure." The praise carried weight beyond mere encouragement. In times when resources were carefully managed, every contribution to the family's welfare mattered deeply. The cottage held the accumulated warmth of careful planning. Root vegetables hung in neat braids from the ceiling beams, onions, garlic, turnips that would add flavor and nutrition to the simple stews that sustained them through the cold months. Bundles of dried herbs perfumed the air with subtle fragrances of summer preserved. Thyme and sage, rosemary and mint, each one representing foresight that now paid dividends in taste and health. In the corner stood the precious stores they had allocated for winter. Sacks of grain carefully rationed to last until spring, crocks of preserved meat and vegetables, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth and aging slowly in the cool air near the stone walls. Every item represented decisions made months ago, calculations of need balanced against availability. The family's evening meal reflected the mathematics of survival. Margaret ladled out bowls of thick barley soup, rich with root vegetables and flavored with herbs from their garden. The bread was darker now, made from a mixture of grains that stretched the wheat further, but it was satisfying and wholesome. A small piece of cheese completed each portion, not lavish but adequate, and made precious by the knowledge that it represented security in uncertain times. As they ate, conversation flowed around the simple pleasures that winter offered to those who knew how to find them. Thomas described the ice patterns he had observed on the mill pond, delicate crystalline formations that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Mary shared her excitement about the new doll she was making from scraps of fabric and wool, a project that would occupy her hands and imagination through the long evenings ahead. John spoke quietly of the conversations he had shared with other men during the brief daylight hours, when weather permitted them to gather. The village was holding together well, he reported. Families were managing their resources carefully, sharing when necessary, helping neighbors who found themselves in particular difficulty. Outside, the snow continued its patient accumulation, but inside the cottage, the Miller family had created a world of warmth and purpose. They worked by firelight until their eyes grew tired, then banked the coals carefully to preserve heat through the night. Before sleep, they gathered once more around the dying fire for the evening prayers that connected them to something larger than their immediate concerns. In the gentle cadence of familiar words, in the circle of faces lit by glowing embers, in the shared understanding that they would wake tomorrow to face whatever challenges came with patience and cooperation, the long winter revealed itself not as an enemy, but as a teacher of the deepest truths about survival, community, and the quiet strength that lies within ordinary people facing extraordinary times. The first green shoots pushed through the frost-hardened earth like tiny fingers reaching toward the pale morning sun, carrying with them the promise that winter's long grip was finally beginning to loosen. Agnes knelt beside her cottage door, brushing away the last patches of snow to reveal the brave points of green that had somehow found the strength to emerge from the cold ground. "Look here, Mary," she called softly to her daughter, who was hanging wet linens on the rope line behind their cottage. "The wild onions are coming up, just as they always do, right on time despite everything." Mary hurried over, wiping her damp hands on her apron, and crouched beside her mother to examine the delicate shoots. These early spring greens were more than just food. They were hope made visible, evidence that the natural world continued its ancient cycle regardless of human worries about harvests and grain stores. The wild onions were just the beginning. Agnes knew where to look for the other early gifts that spring offered to those who understood the forest's generosity. In the days that followed, she would gather the tender leaves of dandelions before they grew bitter, the young shoots of nettle that stung when handled carelessly but provided crucial nutrition after a winter of stored foods, the pale fiddlehead ferns that unfurled like nature's own scrolls in the damp soil near the stream. "Your grandmother taught me to watch for these signs," Agnes told Mary as they carefully harvested the first tender onion shoots. "She said that spring doesn't arrive all at once like a guest knocking at the door, but creeps in slowly, leaving little gifts for those who know how to see them." The knowledge of spring foraging was as vital as any other survival skill, passed down through generations of women who understood that the forest provided medicine and nutrition precisely when people needed it most. After months of relying on stored foods, grains, and preserved meats, root vegetables, and dried herbs, the human body craved the fresh greens that spring offered like a gift from the earth itself. As they walked through the village, Agnes and Mary noticed that they weren't the only ones emerging from winter's hibernation with eyes turned toward renewal. Other women carried small baskets, returning from their own foraging expeditions with the first wild foods of the season. Children who had been confined to cottages through the coldest months now played in muddy yards, their laughter ringing across the village like music. Old Willem stood in his garden, leaning on a wooden staff and examining the soil with the intensity of a scholar reading an important text. The earth was still too cold and wet for planting, but he was reading the subtle signs that would tell him when conditions were right for the spring crops that would determine whether this year's harvest would be better than the last. "The soil speaks differently this year," Willem confided to Agnes when she paused to greet him. "Not worse, mind you, but different. It's had more water than usual, which could be a blessing if the summer turns dry." His weathered hands scooped up a handful of dark earth, crumbling it between his fingers to test its texture and moisture. The village stream, swollen with snow melt, ran fuller and faster than usual. Its voice changed from the gentle murmur of summer to the more urgent conversation of spring runoff. But this too held promise. The water would nourish the fields when planting time came, and the miller's wheel would turn with renewed vigor to grind whatever grain the community could grow. In the forest beyond the cultivated fields, Agnes showed Mary how to identify the early edible plants by their leaves and growth patterns. The wood sorrel with its heart-shaped leaves that added a lemony tang to salads, the young plantain leaves that could be cooked like spinach or used to heal cuts and bruises, the wild garlic that would flavor their simple meals with pungent richness. "The secret," Agnes explained as they filled their basket with nature's early offerings, "is never to take too much from any one spot. Leave enough for the plants to grow strong, and they'll provide for us year after year." This was the deeper wisdom of foraging, understanding that humans were part of the forest's community, not its masters. The relationship between people and wild plants was one of mutual benefit, requiring respect and restraint from those who sought the forest's gifts. As they returned to the village, their basket filled with the pale greens of early spring, Agnes felt something she hadn't quite dared to acknowledge through the long winter months: hope. Not the desperate hope that wishes for miracles, but the steady, earned hope that comes from seeing evidence that life continues, that the earth remains generous to those who understand its rhythms. That evening, as Agnes prepared a soup enriched with their foraged greens, the cottage filled with the fresh, almost bitter taste of spring. It was a flavor that spoke of survival, of renewal, of the promise that even in uncertain times, the natural world continued to offer its gifts to those who knew how to receive them. Outside, darkness fell later than it had the night before, and in that small extension of daylight lay all the promise that spring would always bring to those patient enough to wait for its arrival. As the sun climbed higher and the fields grew green again, the village of Little Ashford settled into the rhythm of a new growing season with hearts that carried the quiet wisdom earned through a year of uncertainty. The strange famine had passed, not with dramatic flourish or miraculous intervention, but with the steady persistence of people who had learned to work together, to share what they had, and to trust in the ancient rhythms that connected them to the earth and to each other. John Miller stood in his newly planted field, watching the first tender shoots of barley push through the dark soil. The earth looked different this year, enriched by the unusual amounts of rain that had initially seemed like such a curse. What had appeared to be a disaster had slowly revealed itself as preparation. The soil was richer, deeper, more capable of supporting robust growth than it had been in years. "Strange how troubles can turn into blessings," he murmured to his son Thomas, who worked beside him, carefully tending the young plants. "Last year's too much rain is this year's good foundation." Thomas nodded, understanding dawning in his young face. At 14, he had lived through his first real test of community resilience, and the experience had taught him lessons that no amount of ordinary prosperity could have provided. He had learned to read the subtle signs of scarcity and abundance, to value the knowledge of elders, to understand that survival was a community effort rather than an individual struggle. Across the village, similar scenes of quiet renewal were unfolding. Agnes worked in her expanded garden, planting not just the usual vegetables, but also experimenting with some of the wild plants she had learned to cultivate during the difficult months. The bitter greens that had sustained them through spring were now growing in neat rows alongside the carrots and cabbages, transformed from emergency food to regular fare. "We eat better now than we did before the troubles," she told her neighbor Sarah, who was admiring the orderly rows of mixed plantings. "Funny how learning to make do with less taught us to appreciate more." The village granary stood as testament to lessons learned. Edmund the Reeve had instituted new practices for storing and tracking grain, systems that would ensure they were never again caught unprepared for unusual weather. But more importantly, the community had developed a deeper understanding of how to support each other through uncertainty. Old Willem sat in his usual spot by the fence, teaching young Emma how to read the clouds that drifted across the summer sky. The knowledge he had shared with his grandson Thomas was now being passed to another generation, ensuring that the weather wisdom earned through centuries of careful observation would continue to guide the community's decisions. "See how those clouds are shaped?" Willem pointed with his gnarled finger toward the horizon. "They're telling us that this year will be different, better, I think. The sky has a settled look to it, like it's remembered how to behave properly." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding that she was receiving something precious. Not just information about weather patterns, but membership in the long chain of knowledge that connected her to all the people who had watched these same skies and learned to read their messages. The year of strange famine had taught the village that survival was not about having abundance in good times, but about maintaining connections and wisdom that could carry them through difficult ones. They had learned to value the knowledge of their elders, the generosity of their neighbors, and the subtle signs that nature provided to those who knew how to observe. Most importantly, they had discovered that hardship, while never welcome, could strengthen the bonds that held a community together. The families who had shared their last loaves of bread, the neighbors who had pooled their resources, the elderly who had shared their knowledge, all had created a web of mutual support that made them stronger than they had been before the troubles began. As summer settled over Little Ashford, the village carried forward the lessons learned during their year of testing. They had faced uncertainty with patience, scarcity with generosity, and fear with the kind of quiet courage that comes from knowing you are not alone. The strange famine had ended not with a single moment of relief, but with the gradual recognition that they had weathered the storm together, that their community had not just survived but had grown stronger, wiser, more connected to each other and to the ancient rhythms that governed their lives. In the end, the greatest lesson had been the simplest one, that ordinary people, working together with patience and wisdom, could endure whatever challenges the world might choose to send their way. As your mind continues to drift through these quiet centuries, carried along by the gentle rhythms of village life and the changing seasons, perhaps you felt the deep peace that comes from understanding how people have always found ways to care for each other through difficult times. Tonight, we've walked alongside people who knew that survival wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic heroics, but about small kindnesses shared between neighbors, about the patient wisdom passed from old hands to young ones, about the quiet strength that emerges when communities choose cooperation over competition. The peasants of Little Ashford discovered what people in every age have learned when they face uncertainty together: that the human spirit is remarkably resilient, that knowledge shared freely becomes wisdom, and that the bonds we forge with each other are often more valuable than the goods we store in our granaries. Their story reminds us that every storm eventually passes, every winter gives way to spring, and every challenge carries within it the seeds of new understanding. The same earth that seemed so unreliable during their strange famine became richer soil for future harvests, just as their community emerged stronger from the experience of weathering uncertainty together. In the gentle rhythm of their days, the kneading of bread, the reading of clouds, the sharing of stories by firelight, they found not just survival, but a way of living that honored both the practical needs of daily existence and the deeper human needs for connection, meaning, and hope. As you settle deeper into your own rest, let their quiet wisdom wash over you like the peaceful silence of snow falling on ancient fields. Let their patient endurance remind you that challenges, however strange or difficult, are temporary, while the capacity for kindness, cooperation, and resilience lives on in every human heart. Sleep well, knowing that you too carry within you the same gentle strength that guided them through their uncertainties, the same ability to find peace in simple things, and the same deep connection to the rhythms that connect all living things across time. But now it's time to rest, to let these distant voices fade into the gentle darkness, carrying with them the timeless assurance that whatever tomorrow may bring, it will be met with the same quiet courage that has sustained people through every age, and that courage lives in you as well. Sweet dreams.